Prison guards. What's the most extreme thing you ever saw happen in your prison? A family member and I used to work at the same prison, and the prisoners knew we were related. My family member got into a car accident and had a few weeks off to recover. Word got out about it to all the prisoners, and I constantly got asked how I was coping because they all heard it was super serious, and wasn't. While one was asking me what happened when we had a lockdown code, so everyone had to go back to their blocks. Came to find out in the incident report that a fight had started because two prisoners heard two different stories on what happened to my family member, couldn't agree, started a punch-up, and got the whole block of about 80 guys brawling. The whole place got locked down for like 10 hours. All because my family member can't drive. Story 2. I did a bid in Florida about 4 years ago. While I was inside, they let my cell block come into the common area to watch the iHeartRadio Awards. Never would have watched it on my own, but it was nice to have the distraction. This was the summer that Ariana Grande had that One Less Problem song, and she performed it right before J-Lo came to the stage. Now, I'm in with mostly Puerto Rican inmates, so J-Lo being on was a big goddamn deal. Some dude just loses his crap during the Ariana Grande song. Some of the dudes said he was into little girls or something, and throws a very lightweight plastic chair at the TV. Didn't think it would do so much damage, but it busted the LCD. Hell broke loose. Dudes weren't gonna get a chance to see J-Lo's ass, and they wanted blood for it. I ran my gringo behind back to my cell, and a 60-man brawl ensued. All of this to say, in the midst of the insanity, one guy bit another guy's thumb off, and swallowed it. Story 3. Between fights, self-unalivings, attempted self-unalivings, etc., worst one that got me was I cut down a hanger. He went into fight mode swinging at us. We got him to the ground and handcuffed him and pinned him on the floor. He started to cry, begging us to kill him as we tried to keep him from banging his head on the floor. That was my first hanging and stuck with me ever since. Edit. Since people are mentioning how depressing this thread is, I gotcha. I was working a pod and had someone throw a melted down shoe heel and a soda can at me. Think hot melted rubber. It mainly got on my shirt, so I was fine, but started fighting with the guy. I had him pinned on the ground, with 64 offenders around me. I had lost my cuffs in the fight. They had fell out away from me. Another offender I had known for a while assisted me, handing me my cuffs and holding the guy's legs down. I was able to drag that one offender out, due to the fact the offenders on the pod were throwing stuff at us. The offender who helped me got his time reduced, and I wrote him a letter for the parole board and spoke on his behalf. He got out, works a good woodworking job, $24 an hour, and writes to the prison with updates on how he's doing. He has a girlfriend and a baby on the way. Happiest story I have of that place. Story 4. My dad was a PE officer in the prison service for a couple decades. He has a few stories. One that I always remember was about there was this one kid who was about 16, but he was about 6'4" and built like a tank. He also had a bit of a temper. One day when my dad is supervising the gym workout, he looks over towards the benches, and this kid picks up a 34 kg dumbbell, lifts it over his head, and starts to swing it down onto another inmate's head who's laying on one of the benches. My dad manages to sprint over, grab this kid, and pin him against the wall, just in time to stop him from killing the other inmate. At this point, my dad is thinking, if this kid wants to fight, he's probably going to win. But luckily, he had a good reputation, so the kid didn't fight, but also other inmates alerted other guards. If he was able to carry through with that swing, that inmate's head would literally have exploded. There's no other outcome to that. It was straight up attempted murder. Nothing ended up happening with the kid. The prison head didn't deem it to be much of an issue because no one was hurt, so my dad brought the 34 kg dumbbell into the meeting to show her. She didn't care, ignored it because it makes her prison look better on paper. So, it does make you wonder how much gets overlooked, swept under the rug in these prisons just to make the outward appearance seem better. You know what I mean? Like murders, brawls, attempted prison breaks. I mean, it's a prison, right? So it's not like there really is any ultimate justice or retribution. Just a thought. Story 5. I was working in the X house. My prison had 3 areas: general population, STC for somewhat mentally unstable IMs, and the X house, shaped like an X, for seriously mentally ill guys that would throw poop, hurt themselves, etc. I was on the seg wing, even though most cells in the X house were like seg anyway. This area had another officer to watch it specifically, so I was called over to watch a guy who had been placed on continuous self-unaliving watch. He was completely naked with nothing else in his cell, and I have to just stand outside the door and watch him. So he's trying to do everything to get a reaction out of me, but I'm Stoneface Phillips, documenting every 5 minutes what he's doing. He climbs up on the bed, takes his chicken in one hand, and starts stroking. He takes a finger from his other hand and wets it in his mouth. The now wet finger goes behind him, right into his ass. And then he starts yelling my last name. We all have name tags. Awake 30, awake 30, awake 30. Then, after he's done doing that, he walks up to the door. These are steel doors with just a window for seeing into the cell. We're basically face to face with this window between us. Just below the window is a chuck hole, which is a tiny door for passing food trays through. Thankfully it was closed, because I look down at the chuck hole and see yellow liquid coming out from the sides of it. I took a few steps back and continued my watch. I wasn't going to let him get a reaction out of me. Story 6. I have many stories, and many about this particular prisoner, but one stands out to me the most. Doing a count one day, everyday stuff, and it involves looking through trap windows to make sure everyone is present and breathing. Get to this prisoner's cell. Let's call him Prisoner X. Now, this prisoner has a long history of SA from his childhood. As a result, he's an absolutely chronic self-pleasure expert. The amount of times I've had to have conversations with him while he's going to town on his ham bone are innumerable. Anyway, doing a count with a female officer. She looks through the trap and immediately recoils. Now all I can hear is a loud buzzing sound and the sounds of furious self-pleasuring. I decide to check the trap against the warnings of my offsider. Should have listened. Turns out he was using the unit's hair clippers, but he had them wrapped in a glove, turned on, and shoved squarely up his arse. All I could see was the cord plugged into the wall leading into his loudly buzzing anus and him giving his old feller the exercise of his life. Edit. Yes, F, I understand I never ended up referring to him as X. I thought I would at the start of the story and then didn't. I'm going to leave it up there though, because I can actually take criticism as well as X can take a pair of clippers. Story 7. Not a CO, but no maintenance staff. One inmate had a court date, so left for the day. Apparently, during his day out, he managed to acquire a loose screw. Not big or anything. Apparently, he found it on the floor of the transport van. Anyway, once back in his cell, he decides to use the screw to drill a hole in the plexiglass window of his door. Mind you, the doors are a layer of plexiglass and then steel grating. Anyway, he drills 2 holes, one at the top and one at the bottom, of about a 2-foot tall window. He does this between CO patrols who are supposed to do a walk-around every 15 minutes. The inmate then proceeds to tear his bedding and ravel it into a string, which he feeds through the upper hole and back down through the lower hole. Using the friction of the bedding, he literally saws a giant hole in the plexiglass using nothing but his bedding. When questioned, he informs the guards that this took him roughly 11 hours to accomplish without a single CO noticing it. He didn't escape. Like I said, there's still the steel grating. He literally just did this as a FU to the guards and he had spare time. Story 8. I, female, teach volunteer in a minimum security male prison. Security level of an incarcerated person doesn't correlate directly with the crimes they're incarcerated for. It's more about their public safety risks, such as reoffending. What that means is my class of minimum security guys has all sorts of offenders in it, including SA, child abuse, and murder. Our class is held a few times a week in a separate building than the main prison, trailer/portable. My most extreme story is one from springtime. It couldn't have been a more gorgeous day, and everyone was chatty about it. Suddenly, a bit of commotion in the back of the class. Hey, teacher lady? I head to the back of the trailer to check things out. Everyone's gathered around a window. What, is there some new CO on the block, or maybe a transfer inmate they're all ragging on? I swear, these guys are just, I thought to myself, preparing for some juvenile nonsense. At that moment, I saw what they could see. A mama cat and her 3 kittens trotting across the yard and settling in under some daffodils for a nap. A collective, "Aww," rose up from the trailer, quickly covered up with abrupt subject changes, crap talking, and class questions, of course. I can't help but smile every time I think about it. Moral of the story, they're just people. Maybe they did some crappy things, like real crappy things, or maybe they didn't and they're in there wrongly. Maybe they've been rehabilitated, or maybe they haven't. Hell, maybe they never will be. But everyone likes kittens. Story 9. I'm a correctional officer, but still in training. Told this story by my instructor, who was a CO for 15 years. He was working in segregation, essentially solitary confinement, but not that extreme in the sense that the inmates here do get to converse with other inmates and do get to populate outside during rec time for only 2 hours each day. But anyways, one of the inmates also had mental health issues, and after 15 days serving in segregation, psychological issues can form. So it got past 3 weeks, and this inmate, who already did not have a sane mind, went absolutely crazy. Took a razor blade and started to hurt his arm until he got to the vein and cut it out and threw it at the door window, smearing it in blood so the COs couldn't see inside the cell. Once that happens, they have to suit up in protective gear and enter the cell with a body-size shield. After pulling him out and sending him to medical to get treatment, he is sent back to his cell after the stitches were sewn. 2 hours pass, and the inmate takes another razor blade and starts cutting open his stomach. These blades aren't the strongest. They're very flexible, so it takes time to actually force it straight enough to cut if removed from the shaving device. He began to cut and spent hours until he cut open his stomach and began to pull out his own intestines. It was a cycle of him going to medical and getting stapled up, and going back to his cell to open his wounds back up until he was put in a turtle suit, straitjacket. These types of experiences aren't abnormal for mental health patients being put in segregation. I mean, I know they're inmates and whatnot, but how many times did this cycle have to play itself out before you finally put him in a straitjacket? Like, this guy is literally disemboweling himself, and apparently that just requires a trip to medical to get stapled back up. You just put him right back in like nothing else happened. It's crazy. Story 10. I was a mailroom employee at the unit in Texas that houses death row. For security reasons, most of death row inmates had their mail constantly scanned or read, while other inmates just had them searched for contraband. This whole process was a knee-jerk process in place after a governor was threatened from DR. Then, bringing the mail to the inmates and telling them you read it and found some crap was terrifying, because they obviously never liked and often threatened violence. The stuff you read is effing insane. I read plenty of neo-Nazi plots to help bring in the New World Order. Stuff that was completely encoded in their own little systems, and all sorts of absolutely depressing crap. The worst one I ever read had to have been the one of an inmate who was scheduled for execution the next day, and was sending a bunch of FU letters to the victim's family, as if they hadn't been through enough. I know this will get drowned, but if anyone has any questions about it, I'm happy to answer. Edit. The families would not receive those letters. They were sent to an ombudsman after being screened, and typically to law enforcement past that. The only way those families would receive it is if they filed a subpoena to get them, I imagine. Somewhat speculation, but I'm fairly certain that's the process. Sorry for any spelling errors and any replies. I'm on mobile. Story 11. Was escorting inmates to the second deck from the first. Now, we were only supposed to escort 6 at a time, and I was the only guard doing the escorting. But we were all in a hurry to get the inmates back in their cells and be on with our day. So I proceeded to pack the inmates into the elevator, similar to what those Japanese guys do to the people at the subway stations. I mean, it was packed. I stepped in and called control to send us up. It was a busy day, so it took a bit for the control officer to get going. I had my head down, looking at the inmate list, when I looked up just in time to see a fist flying at me. I had no time to react. It was danger close. I had a front row seat, less than a foot away, to witness that said fist plunge a broken pencil into another inmate's eyeball. All I had was OC spray, the kind that comes out like shaving cream. I sprayed the bad guy as well as some other poor guys that happened to be too close. The attack was unprovoked. In fact, the two inmates didn't even know each other. The suspect just didn't like the way the other guy looked at him. I never had a single issue with the suspect at all. It was shocking, but it certainly changed how I approached my job. Complacency is very dangerous in an environment like that. Story 12. Not a prison guard, but my good friend is. This happened a week ago. 2 prisoners were shouting and eventually got into a fight, which led to a full-out riot. Where things got extreme was they ripped a TV out of the wall to get to the electrical cables and frayed them, then got bags of toilet papers and used the cables and toilet paper to create fireballs during the riot. Small fires were all over the place, as well as the classic shanks and bludgeoning weapons. Furthermore, all the prisoners used their pillowcases with eyes cut out so they couldn't be identified and proven guilty for anything they did, which led to them really removing any inhibitions. They basically had a room full of the KKK going full riot, murdering each other and flinging fireballs. When the fire department arrived, they tried using the hose to get the cellmates back into their cells, which somehow wasn't working. Sweat and pepperball officers were also brought in. I was watching from outside. It was quite spectacular. Edit. To clarify, because some people don't believe me. Heck, I don't know if even I believe it. Firefighters are first responders, so they come automatically. They did not come specifically for the fireballs. Pepper guns are non-lethal and apparently just hurt a lot, shooting balls of pepper. I was outside. I did not witness things personally. I just saw all the cruisers and vans in commotion. I asked a friend about it. I was across the street at a building that had an adjacent parking lot, not giving more details than that. Story 13. Not me and not a prison guard, but one of my college professors used to teach at a prison. She was a Portuguese/literature teacher for them. This happened in Brazil. She was teaching the inmates, all male, about poetry, and it was close to Mother's Day, so she told them to write a poem about their own mothers. This was in a very impoverished area, and she told us all the inmates were illiterate before she started with them. One of the inmates wrote a beautiful poem about his deceased mother that was killed right before he was arrested when he was much younger. He was arrested for killing his father, who murdered his mom. All the inmates started clapping and whistling because it was so beautiful and heartbreaking. But then the guards went nuts thinking they were messing around and started beating the inmates so they would shut up. Classes were canceled after that. My professor said it was all very shocking. It was a pure scene with people bonding and learning as the guards resorted to violence without even thinking. She never went back to teach at a prison again. Story 14. I was a CEO about 18 years ago at a max pen for 14 to 24-year-olds. It was insane to me that such young kids could be locked up with adults. We had a lot of construction going on in the prison, and they would bring in older convicts to do the work. One day, a young guy started talking crap to an older one, and the older guy hit him in the face with a coffee pot. Lots of cuts and lots of burns. Another time, one of the construction guys snuck a welding rod back into the prison and used it to stab another inmate through his throat. I'll never forget that. I couldn't tell who the victim was because of the amount of blood. Surprisingly, he survived. I was personally involved in two extreme situations. One came my first night being alone after training. A group of 5 inmates jumped me. First one hit me in the back of my head, and I went blind for a second. I couldn't get my bearings, but I knew I needed to get to the unit door so the guard upstairs could let me out and lock them in. I ran for the door, covering my head, and luckily got out. When I was trying to shut the door, which was a large steel door with bolts that shot out to lock it, when it got close to being closed, I shut one of the inmates' feet in it. It crushed his foot. IDK if they were able to save his foot. He was transferred from the hospital to another facility. Then one other time, a guy didn't want to go back to his cell, so he tried to fight me. We were on a balcony about 12 feet up. Imagine a second-floor outdoor hotel. There was a line of cells on the first floor with stairs on each that led up to a line of cells on the second floor. Anyway, he was trying to push me over the railing. We wrestled for a bit, but when he tried to push me off, I started hitting him. In the scuffle, he ended up trying to run and jumped over the railing. I think he wanted to unalive himself, but he landed on both feet, which broke both of his ankles. Prison is real lame for all involved. Story 15. Had to transport an inmate to a hospital for evaluation. He's a violent offender and difficult to manage at the best of times. So naturally, I'm assigned 2 support guards who are pushing retirement, don't want to carry a sidearm, and are totally unhelpful. The guy is effing with the nurses, scaring the crap out of the doctors, and being a total pain in my ass. He's saying foul things. I mean, foul enough that I wouldn't generally repeat them, and is tormenting staff trying to help him. The 2 other guards aren't going to comfort him because they don't want to write an incident report. I get them to get coffee and handle it myself. Seconds after the other 2 dipheads leave, this young nurse comes in and introduces herself. He says he wants to do something disgusting, and she says that he'll be released soon, and he smiles and bites his tongue in 2. Smiles again and tries to say, "How about now?" as his tongue is flapping out of his mouth, blood pouring down and bits of tongue falling onto his chest. I had to excuse staff and physically threaten him. I wasn't afraid of him and told him I was done and was going to beat him to death if he tried something else. I was so mad and talking to him with such peak that he didn't try anything else. I was mere moments from ending his useless life. He was a dangerous offender pulling a life sentence for multiple violent crimes and simply had no remorse for anything. He truly loved hurting people. Story 16. Ozzy correctional officer here. Most extreme would be seeing a mate and fellow officer narrowly miss get stabbed in the neck with a pin. Luckily, it hit cheekbone and ricocheted up behind his left ear. Slice that open though. He's a tough bloke who's been through much worse in the defense force overseas, and he was back at work the next day like nothing happened. Also saw an inmate beaten to within an inch of his life by two other inmates over a drug debt. Blood everywhere. Inmate didn't move until a few seconds before the response team got there. Felt like forever, but was about 30 seconds. Looked dead. Funniest would be one of our more psychotic inmates in a self-unaliving prevention cell. Toilet/shower area were blocked off because he continually flooded his cell/less vision. He's known for producing the largest craps you've ever seen. Gotta be known for something, I guess. Without immediate access to his toilet, he decided to lay the ungodly log in the middle of his cell for all to see. Without exaggerating, this thing was 2 Coke cans together, easy. He left it for about 10 minutes and then proceeded to use his ripped up t-shirt as a balaclava and gloves so he could pick it up. He then threw it with force at the ceiling, which is about 4 meters high. It stuck for a good 15 minutes. It took a lot of persuading to move him without use of force. He was handcuffed to the door to move him to a clean cell, and as the door opened, the log fell and made a distinct thud of the floor. Everyone, including the inmate, had a good giggle at the whole situation. Story 17. Not me, but my stepdad's mom, we'll call her Meg, works as a prison guard, and her husband, my stepdad's stepdad, we'll call him Steve, does construction and home renovation. Steve got a job to renovate a home after the previous tenant suddenly left and the place was found trashed. Carpet was ripped up, holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, the whole 9 yards. Now, it was winter at this point, and the house hadn't been treated for a while, so everything was cold. He's clearing out the junk and grabs a big bundle of rug, all wrapped up, but it's too heavy for him to get by himself, so the guy he's working with comes up and they lug it across the room and throw it out the window. When it lands down below, it unrolls a little, just enough that a hand starts showing. Steve didn't even notice until a little bit later when they're moving all the trash into a big garbage can, one of those industrial metal ones, and he sees the guy's hand. He had been killed, never heard how, and the guy wrapped the body up in the carpet he tore up and fled. Due to the cold, the body had frozen solid inside the carpet and apparently kind of shattered being thrown out the window. Fast forward a year or two, and they finally found the guy who did it. He goes back to jail where Meg works. It's a small town where most people know everyone else, so the guy knows it was Meg's husband who got him caught and hates her. Fast forward a few more months, and he ends up being stabbed to death with a fork. Something like 200 plus stabs, which is a solid 4 to 5 minutes of stabbing straight. Apparently his torso was basically a mush. All of this because he had somehow snuck drugs into the jail and wouldn't share after his cellmate saw it. Meg said she didn't feel too bad about it. Story 18. Not me, but my dad, who was a warden for years. Dad opened up a prison that was developed by a for-profit incarceration company, and it was quite the crap show when my dad was brought on. Even the construction had problems. Things like you could see from the men's showers directly into the women's showers and vice versa. He had entirely new staff, new to corrections, fresh out of the academy, besides him and his second. Anyway, the week the facility opened, i.e. the week they got inmates, Dad's second comes into his office. "You've got to see this, Tom." "See what? I'm busy, Bob." "You really have to come down and see this." Dad goes down to the block, and inmates aren't exactly rioting, but they're all out of their cells, refusing to follow orders, talking crap, getting worked up. And Dad's green staff is cowering in the control room. 300 inmates are pressing into the doors, getting loud and rowdy. My dad looks at the situation, his staff, and his second, says, "Stay on my 6, and wades in. All the instigators are at the front of this crowd, but Dad doesn't engage them at all. He elbows his way through, goes straight to the back where there are inmates who don't really give a crap, but like to watch the ruckus. The leaders of the proto-riot are stuck on the other side of the crowd, and my dad starts shouting commands. "What are you doing out of your cell when we're on lockdown? Get back in your cell for roll call," etc., etc. People at the back start to disperse, and that gains momentum until it's just the few instigators, and now you can deal with the handful left. Plus, they lost all their supporters. My dad is either really brave or really stupid, but prison stories are still my favorite. Story 19. As a former CO, once you're out of the jail system, which is problematic no matter where you are, the prison system isn't like that. Inmates are given a security classification and then sent to the appropriate prison for their designation. Suppose you get busted for meth. Unless you were arrested with a gun and trying to fight police, you're not getting a violent status and will be sent to either a medium or minimum security institution, depending on how likely they think you are to try and escape. The problem is, at maximum security facilities, you have people who are completely and totally devoid of fear, inhibition, and willingness to play by the rules. To be forced into maximum security and stay there requires you to be the kind of person that simply doesn't take initiative to play by the rules. Engage with the support services available and work your way down to a lower security classification. The fact is, even if you're a murderer with a life sentence, it's possible to serve your last years in a minimum security institution or some sort of community establishment. But the people who don't are animals. I saw stabbings, I saw beatings, I saw swarmings, I saw someone bite someone. The television/movie trope of a non-violent offender trying to survive a max security prison just doesn't happen. People like that aren't thrown in there willy-nilly. Guards aren't there to watch the world burn. But those who've worked in a high-security institution know just how difficult it is, and often because the population we're dealing with only know violence, and often there simply isn't anything anyone can do. We used to get offenders from the secure psych hospitals. Often, they were just too violent and too dangerous for even secure psych hospitals and would be returned to prison. That's how violent they could be. Story 20. Alright, so I was looking for a job some years back. Any job. I ended up catching on as a teacher in a youth prison. Basically, this place was populated by all boys, age 14 to 16, I think? Something like that. My job was as a computer lab administrator, where they took pre-GED and other computerized tests. There were some other teachers there as well that taught other classes. I was a staff member of the school portion of the institution. Tame, yes, but still a prison. I had to be searched to enter the premises. Phone had to stay in the car, etc. So I went through the general prison guard training for 2 weeks at another prison. Self-defense training, the whole 9 yards. I went through that with newly hired guards for the state prison, etc. I start my stint at the youth facility and everything is going okay. We're outside the fence on lunch smoking cigarettes, and one of the actual guards tells me there are 2 or 3 new students coming that day, and asked me if I wanted to watch. Watch, I said? Watch what? He explains that when they first arrive, they shave their head and strip them down naked and really embarrass them. This place was a military boot camp style facility. The more he describes this process, I just get sick to my stomach. It was at this point that I recognized that while corrections may be a necessary part of our society, it is one that is certainly not for me. For a variety of reasons, I ended up leaving the job a few days later. Story 21. My dad worked at the jail in Boston and has a ton of stories. I'm just learning about them now since I'm old enough to hear them. Once when I was 7, my dad came home covered in human feces because of a fight that broke out. Neo-Nazis and the like were Dad's least favorite group. He said there were gangs and stuff going on, but he remembers you would get a white guy that had killin' words written on his boots, and my dad would love to put him on the floor with the majority of the black people. My dad said one guy said they would own them or whatever, and one jail guard that worked with my dad said to him, "They're going to distract us and get you." And then a few hours later, that guy was begging to come out. Also, my dad used to bring home rubber pens because you can sharpen real pens into a weapon. My sister and I used to like the rubber ones. Picture the ink tube inside of a regular pen surrounded by rubber. No story there, just a fun fact. Story 22. I've got lots, but I'll start with just one. My facility had several cell configurations. This happened in a 24-man tank. There was one inmate that repeatedly stole from the other inmates and was caught red-handed. He was about to get his ass beat when one inmate stepped in to defend him. He reasoned that since all the stolen items had been recovered, that the thief should be cut some slack. The rest of the tank went along with it, but decided that if he was caught again, that the inmate who defended him would have to take care of it himself. Inevitably, he stole again within a week. The inmate used a broomstick to break both his hands and beat him across the face so hard that he broke his nose, both cheekbones, his jaw, the orbits of his eyes, and ruptured one of his eyeballs. When he was done, he called control for one of us to get the pile that was left. The guy looked like a male orangutan in the face, with the big, flat cheek pads. His eyes were swollen shut. His tongue was so swollen that he couldn't fit it in his mouth. The medics had to give him a trach so he could breathe. Story 23. Mine is from a closed asylum. I was pretty young, about 19, and checked in for my first shift ever. I went to the door and rang the bell. There was an electric lock which opened remotely, but the door was also held with some sort of cautionary chain higher up, so it only opened about 4 to 5 inches. Anyway, I press the bell, the door swings open and is caught by the chain. Into the crack pops a head of a goblin, just in front of my face, with a screeching, wide-open irk of a laugh from a toothless mouth. In his forehead, there are several vertical slashes of deep cut wounds agape, gushing blood on my sneakers. The craziest welcome I've ever got. Stayed in the job some time before starting my studies. The guy welcoming me was the serial self-mutilator in residence who had just banged his head open on the sharp corner of the outer door frame. Usually there was a door to cover the frame, but it was left open for me. About the guy, he was friendly to other people, but really was hell-bent on hurting himself. I ended up picking him up once when he jumped through a window. Another time I went after another patient for a second, and the guy immediately bolted to the nearest pine tree, caught some cones, and ate them before I could catch him. His teeth had already been removed because he hurt his wrist with them. For anyone thinking inhumane practices, this was decades ago, and people were really just protecting the guy from himself. Story 24. Was, for a short time, a CEO at a level 3 institution in the South. 1. 23-year-old was refused a second peanut butter sandwich because he was no longer on a diet per the doctor. Decided to get completely naked, cover himself head to toe with his own peanut butter, and stab one of my academy buddies in the shoulder with a paperclip. We then had to gas him and execute a forced cell extraction. 5 guys in riot gear had to take this guy down, which he was naked and covered in crap. This is my second extraction. 2. Inmate was insulted by another and decided to retaliate by putting a cup of Vaseline in the microwave and then threw it in the guy's face, leaving him with serious third-degree burns on his face and in his mouth. Dude got his eye socket caved in shortly after that. 3. We had most of the cutters in the state. These guys were very knowledgeable of the vascular system in the human body, would cut only what they needed to get high. Once in a while, some guys would miss and hit a big artery. Watched a dude right after he hit in the main artery inside his elbow. Projectile blood must have been well over a foot in the air. Watched him slowly sag down a wall while passing out. We had to squeegee the congealed blood off the floor. Buckets of it. Not my favorite story. 4. This was the worst. One of the cutters, as mentioned above, liked to open his abdomen. Big opening, like 6 inches wide. One day, we heard him complaining about a stomachache and told him to suck it up. He kept on about it, so we went to check it out. He had opened his stomach up and shoved trash and light bulb pieces inside of himself. I believe he had a crush on one of the nurses in the hospital, and this was his ticket to see her. That's love? Story 25. I worked in a prison in Iraq. We were training Iraqis to take the prisons over. We had about 8 separate buildings known as K-spans. We had turned one over to the Iraqis just to see how they could handle it. They didn't do well. When we got the call, we were just about to get off a 12-hour shift. We were in the middle of a shift change, so both sides were present. Apparently, the detainees thought this would be a confusing time for the guard force, but instead it meant we had double the amount of manpower. Back to the call. The Iraqis had lost the whole building. Their detainees had started to riot, and one cell, which contains about 20 men, was able to break a hole in the cell and escape. Luckily, there are more layers of razor-wired fence they have to get through before freedom. We get a call saying they need help at the K-span. We grab tasers, riot shields, and flexi-cuffs and start running. Of the 2 layers of razor wire to freedom, we're now inside the same layer as about 100 escaped detainees. From outside the fences, other guard forces see us rushing into the riot and are all screaming, "F 'em up!" It was a very charged situation. The run was about 500 yards. As I approach the K-span, I see the Iraqi correctional officers, ICOs, in the rec yard. They have makeshift weapons trying to defend themselves from escaped detainees. 2x4s and other debris from the building being destroyed. They were effed. Detainees hated the ICOs, probably more so than Americans. They saw them as traitors, which if I were in a detainee's shoes, I would too. And now it was 100 versus 10. We can only see the rec yard, not access it. We had to run around the entrance and go through the building to get to it. Basically, there was a riot of 100 men between us and the ICOs. We had to get the riot under control before we could help them. I was about the 10th U.S. Guard force to show up. We immediately ran inside the building. It was chaos. Inside the K-span, there are 20 cells, 5 on the left side, 5 on the right side, on 2 floors. 20 men per cell. Most cells, they weren't able to escape and were still inside, but one cell escaped and must have gotten keys as they opened about 4 more cells. All the cells on the lower right side were open, roughly 100 men. A single hallway ran the perimeter of the cells, so we sent a team of riot shields in each direction to corral the detainees back to their cells. One team went right, the other left. I went behind my buddy, who had a shield. I had a taser. As we walked the hall, there are detainees in cells next to us and above us. They have igloo coolers they use for tea and are filling them with whatever body fluid they can produce and raining it down on us. The noise, the smell, the thunder of hundreds of men pounding on the cages next to us. Pieces of building and debris are crunching under our footsteps as we make our way around the left side. We're now at the back door of the building, which is the entrance to the rec yard. It was empty. The detainees must have realized there was no escape from the rec yard and came back in after beating the crap out of the ICOs. I didn't see them either. We shut and locked the door and continued around the perimeter hallway. We now made it around to the other side. Here we found all the detainees charging and getting ready to fight the other line of shielded guard force. The cells had a layer of plexiglass split shields that have now been shattered into swords, which the detainees are now wielding. The 2 teams of shields began to come together, forcing the detainees toward the center. Most of the detainees gave up and simply went back into their cells. About 20 were persistent and came charging for the shields, where they were easily detained. We finally pushed the last of the fighters back through the hole in the cell they busted out. These prisons were built cheap. The cells didn't have bars. They had a single layer of expanded metal grating as bars. They were able to beat a hole in it using an old man's crutches. It was about 3 feet in diameter. We got the detainees back in the cell, but now we had to go through and cuff them. My buddy and I were the first to crawl through the hole. He put his shield in first and followed behind it. There were about 10 to 15 men in there. Most had already given up and laid down, but 5 or so wanted to fight. I crawled through immediately behind my friend and immediately deployed the taser. Homie hit the ground. Funny thing about a taser is I can still tase you with the gun portion after I've fired the leads. Only those leads still shock every time I pull the trigger, so the poor bastard I got with the leads had got shocked again every time I had to use the gun to tase one of his buddies. It didn't take long for more guard force to get in behind us, so the detainees gave up quick. We cuffed them and began moving them out, then went to clean the cocktail of body fluids off of ourselves. This was all at the end of my 12-hour shift. What a day. The ICOs who originally lost the prison were okay. The detainees beat the F out of them, but spared them. They didn't come back to work as far as I know. Story 26. Nurse at a women's prison for a year or so. Inmate cut the line for her bunk's microwave and put her ramen in. She got that microwave to the face about 30 seconds later. Had a psych inmate who chronically swallowed things. Forks, batteries, hair barrettes, razor blades. They were allowed to shave their legs. Well, after that incident, she didn't get to anymore. More faked seizures than I can even count, which isn't extreme, I guess, but incredibly annoying. Most of the prison was bunkhouses, similar to what you see in OIT and B, but some of our older areas did have actual cells. Had an inmate not come out for like 2 weeks. Cells were open for Gen Pop. They were supposed to come and go to their jobs in group meetings and the like. After so long, we have to do an extraction, where the guards suit up in gear. It was my first extraction. I was on hand because they may use fox spray. I laughed at first because she was like an 80-pound Philippine woman, against 4 dudes and 2 women in near riot gear and fox spray. Then my jaw dropped because she took them on and nearly effing won. My eyes still water thinking about it, because the fox spray definitely hit all of us to some extent. I've never flushed more eyeballs in my life. Had an inmate keep coming in with yeast infections to sick call. She kept denying sexual activity or anything that could be the cause. Finally got the truth of it. She had made a dildo out of Jolly Rancher candies. It took a lot of education to get her to understand that sugar in the vagina is a no-go. I want to put in a formal request to get more information about the 80-pound Filipino woman beating back 4 men and 2 women in riot gear and fox spray. That sounds like that would make an awesome set piece in a movie. Story 27. CO for almost a decade. Worked segregation and psychiatric units for most of it. In the segregation unit, some guys are supposed to be allowed to rec together, and some are supposed to be kept separate, for their or other safety. 2 inmates that had been heard threatening each other were accidentally let out together. In the 90 seconds from the time their cell doors opened to the time we stopped the fight, one of the inmates had knocked the other down, kicked his head and stomach, and then kicked his scrotum so hard that the testicles tore their way out of the skin and became true external genitalia. In the psych unit, it's not uncommon for inmates to pay others, inmate janitors, one-on-one psych watchers, etc., to get a piece of razor blade. When I say a piece, I mean something like an eighth or a tenth of the blade. They do this in order to self-harm, whether it's to actually accomplish the act or just get more attention. On one particular occasion, an inmate procured one of these small pieces and managed to use it to cut through his abdominal wall in about 10 minutes. We were made aware of the problem by him hanging on his cell door while he stood in the door window chewing on his own intestines. Those are probably two of the worst, but I have a lot more. I think the funniest story I can't usually tell in other company is when we found out how long it takes to bake a potato inside a man. Story 28. Just a small FYI. Prison guard is kind of a term that corrections officers don't like. It's like calling a paramedic an ambulance driver or a firefighter a hose dragger. Worked as a medic at a fire station that covered the local prison and jails for about 13 years. Saw more than a few murders and assaults there, but the first stabbing at the prison sticks in my mind. We got there and they were doing CPR on an inmate who was covered in blood, and when the nurse ventilated him, bubbles blew out of his head. Normally we wouldn't work that, but the prison wanted all deaths pronounced at the hospital, so we got started. While we were working, I kept hearing people say, he got the 5-speed, or they gave him the 5-speed, and I didn't know what that was. After the call, I asked a CO, and they said they stick a shank into the skull and work it like a gear shift. He explained it with the hand motion and all, and finished up with, they call it the 5-speed, but it's shifting into reverse that really does it. And he laughed, and I went on my way a little bit wiser and far more committed to never going to prison. Story 29. I work at a hospital near a prison. These guys will gash their scrotes from chicken to gooch for a trip out to see us, and they'll do it all in teams. Been happening for years. Bunch of guys via EMS with their self-bloodied goodies hanging out. Cells get tossed more often over there now because we're not a huge hospital, and they do it in the middle of the night, which can really tie up our ER staff, which makes other patients wait or causes us to go on divert status. Dispatch diverts EMS to other hospitals because our ER resources are tied up for a brief time. Anyway, about 2 weeks ago, one of these guys got an extended stay with us due to sepsis after his wound became infected. Since I work ER and ICU, I was able to follow his case. Scrotal edema is pretty common in the ICU due to large amounts of IV fluid and the way patients are positioned in the bed. This guy's balls would not heal. The wound just festered and wept and stank. He eventually had to have surgery to remove a bunch of necrotic tissue, inside and out, from scrot, gooch, thigh, and part of one ass cheek. Almost died. And he really just carried himself like a regular guy through his entire day. Story 30. Posted this a few months ago in a similar thread. Corrections here. When I was the first on the job, I was doing an overtime shift in the maximum security unit. It was my Friday, 1 hour to go, and my birthday weekend at that. At 1400, while counting the minutes, a call comes out on the radio. Central Control, activate IMS. Housing Unit 3. Inmate is refusing to cuff up and has broken the fire sprinklers in his cell. Requesting A-team response. Put B-team on standby. IMS is code for locking down everything. When you hear an IMS call, it means every inmate that's not in a cell must be secured. It's serious crap because when an event like this occurs, other officers must leave their respective posts to assist, which means officers that remain on their units while their counterparts assist are now even more outnumbered, and that can easily spiral out of control. In short, any event like this is a serious security threat. In this case, Max was put on lockdown while the rest of the institution kept about their business. Interesting thing is, when an IMS comes out for Max, the collective prison sphincter cinches up a bit because Max is where the real violent crap goes down. An A-team is always the first to respond. But the kicker with this one was the command to put the B-team on standby. This means crap has hit the fan, and anyone not immediately supervising inmates would be required to respond if so commanded. A B-team deployment to Max would send the rest of the 7,000-bed institution into a complete lockdown. All doctor appointments, visits, movement throughout the buildings is completely locked down. You'd hear Sally Port doors slamming shut everywhere. Really cool to experience it, honestly. There's also C, D, and E teams. If those were ever called, well, it shouldn't ever get to that point. Anyway, being the new guy, I was elected to respond. When I arrived at the briefing area, we were immediately ordered to put on our riot gear and biohazard coveralls. Other officers helped us suit up so no skin was exposed. Only being a few weeks out of the academy, I did crap myself. This was not only my first A-team response, but it was also a biohazard. Blood, semen, urine, crap? Which is it, Sergeant? All of them. I don't believe in Jesus, but I did briefly in that moment. When we were escorted onto the unit, it was a war zone. The entire housing unit was full of gas, fire alarms blaring, red lights flashing everywhere. Even though we had our gas mask on, it didn't help as we had to put them on in a hurry. The first responding officers had to go in without any protective gear. The mother effer was still in his cell. He had been gassed, maced, and hosed. He was unrelenting. I thought, he's got to be on PCP. Then I remembered this is Max. Nothing gets in or out. The inmate was ass naked, covered in God knows what, screaming unintelligibly. He was bleeding from his arms due to having bitten full chunks out of them. His cell was watered down from the sprinklers and from getting sprayed with any number of OC variants. The best part? This man, in all his naked splendor and rage, was 120% erect. The fullest boner you've ever seen. Something deep inside his primordial mind had gotten irrevocably turned on through all of this. Even his chicken being exposed to OC spray did nothing to stop it. We stack up in a line. For cell breaches, 6 of us would line up in a stick. The guy on point always had the shield. 2 to 5 had the cuffs. The last guy was the moderator. He or she would give the inmate a final opportunity to comply, because the pain was effing coming. Inmate, this is your last opportunity to approach the door and cuff up. Do you comply? Of course not. When this inmate saw us line up, however, something changed. As if the Holy Spirit woke to him. He cuffed up, was dragged out of his cell, still erect by the way, and thrown into a shower. I didn't even get to breach the cell. The sight of 6 officers in full riot gear lining up outside your door, and you knowing full well they're gonna find a way to all fit in your cell in less than 3 seconds, can be a really humbling experience. Story 31. I already posted about the most disturbing thing I ever saw, but the funniest thing I ever saw was still kind of disturbing. There is an inmate who believed he had a demon in his sink. He begged us to spray the sink with pepper spray so the demon would go away and stop talking to him. He wouldn't shut up, and he was waking up all the other inmates in the hospital ward. I decided to call my sergeant. My sergeant came in and, after talking to the guy for a while, said, "Screw it, let's pretend to spray the sink with some pepper spray." My partner was a rookie, had only been on the job for a couple weeks, and he had a pepper spray container that looked like a small fire extinguisher. Rather than pretending to spray the sink with pepper spray, he actually fired it off. Its blast splashed back on us, so we were both coughing and slightly blinded. The inmate who was handcuffed in the corner of the cell behind us came rushing over, knocking us both out of the way, stuck his face in the sink, took a deep breath, and with pure joy in his face yelled, "Yeah, take that, you mother effer! F you! Now who's a female dog?" When he was done yelling at the demon, he started dancing around with glee. I calmed down and was happy the rest of the night. I had a Ghostbusters t-shirt made for my rookie partner that said, "I ain't afraid of no sink demon." Story 32. My dad worked in a maximum security prison for about 25 years. Said they were watching the cameras and one inmate snuck up on and stabbed another inmate. Over and over again, like tens of times, over and over and over again. So the guards are scrambling to get there and try to save this guy's life. They get there and there's no blood and they're still fighting. They break up the fight and turns out the sharpened toothbrush the inmate had made wasn't sharp at all. He didn't even break the guy's skin with all those stabs. Asked him what's the most inventive thing he's seen made. Said they found 2 pull-up bars, a C-shaped handle attached to an inmate's ceiling for pull-ups, made out of oatmeal, or something like oatmeal, and toilet paper, like paper mache. He said it was so strong, not only could it support a grown man hanging from it, he had to hit it off piece by piece with his flashlight, and it took a lot of hits before it came down. Story 33. 2 years ago, I was working as a gun rail officer on my quad, which is the recreation yard area for a set of 4 housing units. I'm monitoring my area when all of a sudden I hear shots fired in the quad adjacent to mine, followed by absolutely frantic radio chatter. An inmate was being brought back from the infirmary where he was being treated from a fight he had been in earlier that day. As he was entering the quad, 2 other inmates rushed him. The escorting officers attempted to spray aggressors with OC, but they ran right through it and stabbed the inmate to death. Nearly the entire institution responded to the incident, and all I could do was recall and lock down my quad and provide any additional gun coverage for them. The CERT lieutenant performed CPR while they brought down 2 crash carts from the infirmary in an attempt to stabilize him, but he had already lost so much blood that he died before a flight for life had even gotten to the institution. Apparently, he had been stabbed multiple times in the liver, stomach, kidneys, and lungs. To this day, the shank that the aggressors used is still the biggest I've ever seen. The following months, the entire institution was on lockdown. It was just all bad. Story 34. I worked in the jail for a little over a year when I was a probationary police officer. Guy came in, disruptive, combative. We put him into the single-occupant padded cell until he would calm down to be processed, i.e. fingerprinted, pics, etc. Our policy at the time was you go in there stripped down. He begged me to let him keep his underwear, and dumbass me, I did. A few minutes later, I hear the trustees yelling for me to bring the keys. I grab them and run to the cell. I'm the only officer in that area on duty. The dude is hanging by his neck in a noose fashioned out of his underwear that I let him keep, swinging gently back and forth, dying. F me. I fumble around with the keys while screaming at the trustees to hit the panic button. Hidden button to inform the receiving desk officers I need help. Now. I get the door open, run in, and lift this huge guy wrapping my arms around his buttocks area to get some slack on his neck. He craps all over my right forearm. Short sleeve uniform. Other officers enter, climb up and untie him. He coughed and sputtered back to life. I ran into him years later and I recognized him, but he didn't recognize me. I told him I was the guy that you crapped on. He apologized and thanked me for saving his life. Said he was clean and sober now and seeking mental health treatment. Story 35. I'm no longer a CO, but worked for approximately 5 years. Thank God that's over. I was advised to move an inmate from strip to a different cell. Strip is an area that inmates that could harm themselves are placed and only given a smock suit, also referred to as a turtle suit. The inmate was acting irrationally by growling at me and shaking the bars. I called classification back and told them, due to safety, I will not move the inmate by myself. I also advised my supervisors of the same. Usually, they'd get a group of 4 guys and do it as safely as possible. This LT shows up that thinks he's hot crap and says he'll move him himself. I'm like, whatever, go ahead. But I already knew it was going to go downhill. The LT opens a cell door and the inmate pushes him and runs past him butt-ass naked. I start chasing the inmate down a hallway corridor. He was sprinting naked right towards a dead end. The inmate finally gets cornered and starts growling and roaring like a lion. Being cornered with nowhere to go, he charges towards me. I used his forward momentum and dumped him right on the floor. The inmate is still fighting and trying to bite me and hit me. The LT is just standing there like a moron. Finally, my friends show up to help. The inmate fought for a good 30 minutes until he was injected by something by the EMS crew. He fought so hard he ended up breaking his trachea, ribs, and ankle. He flailed violently, just thrashing everywhere. Turns out, he had received a drug that was laced with some bad crap. I talked to the inmate a week or so after. The drug was out of his system, and he was like a different person. He ended up apologizing. Best thing was, his LT looked like a giant idiot and a wuss because it was all on camera. He stood by as his officer was trying to restrain a violent individual. That's something you'll never live down in your career, and it's remembered forever. There are so many other stories, doing CPR on an inmate that has visibly broken his neck, hanging self-unaliving, because you have to until EMS shows up. Then, having their ribs break and go down to their pelvis is something I'll never forget. Having an officer stabbed in front of me by a shank, trying to process it after and still doing your job, knowing one day someone may go after you. Overdoses, brawls, stabbings, completed and attempted self-unaliving. If you're a CO long enough, you'll see it all. Story 36. I'm not a prison guard, but I did construction, steel paneling, at a prison about 5 years ago. It was a maximum security prison for the criminally insane. When I asked why all the inmates were wearing socks and no shoes, he said that shoes and even flip-flops are not allowed whatsoever. I asked why flip-flops, and he said that one inmate was able to file the side edge of his rubber flip-flop against the wall down to a wedge thin enough that when enough force was applied, he was able to hurt himself. More specifically, he was able to eviscerate himself with that flip-flop. Just a severely schizophrenic prisoner trying to end it. They said that self-unaliving was more of a problem at that prison than violence between inmates. Another crazy thing about that prison was that only one person had ever gotten out, as in released, not escaped. That prison was almost 100 years old, and every single inmate that was ever locked up in there had either died in prison or was still serving their sentence, except one. It was an 8th-month job/contract, and I had little to no experience, but no felonies, which is how I got it. We were able to put up 2 panels in 2 days. There were 3 of us working, including the foreman. When we got back on day 3, one of the panels, 9x9 foot steel barred fencing, was on the ground. A guard said that an inmate snuck in and ripped it off the steel frame with his bare hands. We had used self-tapping screws, which to me would make such a feat impossible. I was so creeped out. We put up 2 more panels that day, but the next day, 1 more was removed and there were noticeable dry blood stains in the concrete and on the steel. I quit that day. I quit construction altogether and went back to production. It was a long and cold winter. Story 37. The most intense thing is between responding to a man hanging himself in a seg cell, human instinct telling me to open the door and cut the sheet, but training kicking in to wait for backup. Or the first time I got to ride in a helicopter, an offender took the chain off a weight bench and beat another offender with it. The victim held his arm above his head and blocked most of the attacks. He had to be flown out though, because the swelling in his arm was so severe it would kill him. It never occurred to 19-year-old me that you could die from a deep bruised arm. The most extreme thing I've ever seen? I see some guys grouped up around this bunk. Sometimes a sign something is about to happen, and I go to see what's up. It's a bunch of young dudes and they wave me over. Bro, no homo, but look at this guy's chicken. I'm good. Carry on. No, it's cool. Look. They were filing down domino pieces into hearts or stars, slicing open their chicken, inserting the domino, and stitching it back up. In prison. They're doing this in prison because, quote, their girls love it. Weeks later, I go on another medical run because this dude's member became so inflamed and infected that it split open. He needed emergency surgery to stitch it back up. It had been infected for days, but he never told anyone because he was more afraid of getting in trouble. I'm a male, and that story I believe is the most extreme. That image and his screams still make me cringe. So I think I'm going to go ahead and speak on behalf of every single male on the planet, especially those that just tuned in and listened to that story when I say that is like absolute nightmare fuel. I cringed and recoiled and like just instinctively flinched reading that. Like I felt the pain. That was a little too visceral. God, that's rough. Story 38. My story is a bit different. I worked as a prison guard for 1 day before quitting. I went to work for a prison in Louisiana that's now shut down. Did a week of classroom training, and on the first official day, I saw guards mocking prisoners' religion. 2 white guards mocking a black Muslim inmate for his beliefs, tossing his Bible around, "You believe in this crap?" comments, etc. I'm white, and most of the guards were, and most of the inmates were black. One of the senior guards/sergeants or whatever told me and 2 other new guards in a giddy voice, "Watch this!" He took a pen out of his shirt pocket and dropped it on the ground at his feet. Then he called a black inmate by name to come over. The inmate was maybe half a football field away, and he jogged the entire way. Once he got to us, the guard said, "Hand me my pen." The inmate bent down, picked it up, and handed it to him. The guard said, "That's all. Go back to what you were doing." And the inmate jogged back to where he was before, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. And the guards all started laughing. And the main one started talking about showing them who holds the power, etc. I believe in letting inmates know that they must follow rules and all, but it just made me sick to my stomach, and I knew I couldn't work there. I quit at the end of the day and went back to my old job. So just shout out to OP here for having some kind of moral standard. No amount of salary in the world is worth participating in basically what's modern slavery. I know these are inmates, but that doesn't give you any kind of right to a superiority complex in this situation. So yeah, screw that prison. Glad it got shut down. Good on OP for bailing. Story 39. I'm no longer in corrections, but definitely have a few stories from my time behind the fence. A tall, lanky, older gentleman that I'll call Suave was in segregation to be under watch. He was in an observation cell, which is monitored 24 hours a day by camera from the segregation control cab. I was out on a walk when a call came over the radio to check on Suave. I met another officer there to find this man stark-ass naked and prancing around his cell. He proceeded to lay on his bed and bring his legs to his knees to his shoulder in what appeared to be an attempt to suck his own chicken. In retrospect, that would have been better than what he actually had planned. Suave takes a full-size shampoo bottle and begins trying to shove it up his ass. We tried to stop him and talk him out of it, but the act continued. Suave didn't even bother lubricating the damn thing with the shampoo from the bottle. No, he was intent on this bottle going in dry. After approximately 30 minutes of struggle, this man successfully shoved an entire shampoo bottle up his rectum. Not being satisfied with the distance he had achieved, He took a toothbrush and, upon standing and bending over, Suave began shoving the bottle further in his ass by stabbing it with said toothbrush. By this time, there was a considerable amount of blood involved. Once he was satisfied with his achievement, Suave decided he needed to clean himself up by taking paper towels and wiping his legs, between his butt cheeks, and his bloody a-hole. Then turning to me and looking me square in the eyes as he proceeded to stick his tongue entirely out of his mouth and lick this bloody, crappy, nasty paper towel. Suave then decides he needs to pee. Still naked and bleeding, he stands facing the toilet, visibly having difficulty with his stream. He turns, peering over his shoulder, and says to us, "It sure is hard to take a piss with a shampoo bottle in your ass," with an amusing chuckle. I have so many stories, but this is by far my favorite. Story 40. I used to work at a paint store, and one of the contractors I was good friends with did a pretty good stint as a guard some years back. We used to always talk to him about it, and he would always laugh at us and jokingly yell, "You can't handle the truth." One night, he came in to pick up an order, and he was really down about something. He was always the joyous type, so I immediately asked him what was wrong. His speech was slurred, and I could tell he was drunk. Around his third or fourth year as a guard, he and the other guards were dealing with this trio of what he called non-humans. As he's Hispanic, I attempted to breach the language barrier and ask him what he meant by non-human, but he didn't elaborate. They were particularly aggressive towards a specific inmate, and there were several fights over the course of several months, each more violent than the last. He said the next morning he went to work, and after doing his rounds, he noticed all the prisoners in a cell block were standing and facing the viewing window. He called for backup, and they stormed the area. The prisoners all had a look of what he described as pure childlike terror. There is a blood trail leading to the specific inmate's cell. Inside, they found a severed finger in an enormous pool of blood. He said it looked as if someone had tried cleaning it all up. They asked the inmates what happened. Nobody answered. They checked every inmate for a missing finger. None were missing any appendages. After asking several times what happened, an inmate stepped forward, pointed at the trio, and said, "They killed him." They asked him where the rest of the inmate was. The man whispered, "They ate him. They killed him and they effing ate him." I stared at him. I was frozen. I was trying to process what he said. He looked at me, and the haunted look in his eyes was harrowing. He said they never found his body, nor his clothes, nor any other piece of him other than the severed finger. The blood had been partially consumed, and he said the trio were engorged, as if they had eaten several Thanksgivings. He was right. I couldn't handle the truth. I never questioned him about it again. My coworker kept asking about him, but his answer was always the same. When that same coworker began questioning me on the subject after he noticed I stopped asking, I replied, "You can't handle the truth. Some things are better left unsaid." Story 41. I worked in a prison in the UK, which is very different to a US prison. One day we had the full staff meeting, which was held in the chaplaincy since it's the only room big enough that didn't have inmates in it on a Thursday evening. I haven't worked there long and noticed that the chairs were all chained together, and I asked another guard why that was. Apparently, this prison had an issue with gangs and was one of the few prisons in the UK where wings are separated by gang affiliation. So people from different gangs never saw each other inside the prison as their schedules were slightly different. There had been a new inmate from Gang A who was in prison for beating up his secret girlfriend from Gang B. After it emerged, she was pregnant. Hence, there's a lot of guys in the prison from Gang B that wanted this guy's head, but because of the wing separation, they couldn't meet him. So in the UK prison, everyone has a right to religion. So no matter what wing you're on, if you say you want to go to church on a Sunday morning, they have to let you. So a load of the inmates decided that this was where they would have a rumble. It went on for a few weeks. Every Monday, there would be another guard with a fresh black eye. Apparently, the guy from Gang A got stabbed in the head with a pencil. I think he survived, but probably didn't go back to church anytime soon. I only worked in the prison service for 6 months before doing my PhD, but it was a very interesting place to work. Story 42. Heard this from my friend's dad. The COs were inspecting a block of cells, and they had this one guy that refused to come out of his cell. Now, you'd think that they'd just go in and drag his ass out, and normally they would, but this particular inmate was a black belt martial artist, and nobody wanted any smoke from him. So the guards have this bright idea that they would go get one of the canine dogs and threaten the guy with it until he came out. They go and get the dog, a big old German Shepherd, of course, and tell the guy that if he doesn't come out, they're gonna chuck the dog in there with him. The inmate responds by taking a deep breath and dropping into a karate stance like effing Liu Kang. What happened next is something I would pay good money for a video of. The guards look at each other, shrug, and open up the door so the dog can tear this guy up a little bit. The dog rushes into the cell at full speed, and in one fluid motion, the guy picks the dog up, using its own momentum to swing it up over his head, and smashes it into the ground, knocking it out cold. I don't remember how they finally got him out, but I bet they thought real hard about their next move. Story 43. I was a CO for 3 years in a male prison. I'm a female. I've seen some crap. I don't even know where to start. Worst I saw was a guy who was shanked right beside me. I was walking beside, yes, beside, not behind, because I was a stupid new officer, a bunch of inmates who were leaving the lunch hall. I was in a hurry to relieve another officer in a cell house, I think. Anyway, out of the corner of my eye, I see an inmate rush forward and just flat out shank a guy from behind. There was blood everywhere. Guy lived. His brother asked why I didn't stop the guy from stabbing him, and I apologetically explained that it just happened too fast. Other guy got tackled and hauled off the seg, by the way. I'm sure he was charged, but I didn't pay any attention to that. My favorite post was seg. I liked the crazies. I got to know them fairly well. Had lots of very candid conversations about why they were there. One had killed his wife in a rage. He had described in detail how he strangled her, and it was, of course, the biggest regret in his life because not only did he end her life, but now his little girl has to live without both her parents. Anyway, so one night in Seg, we had a guy who got a hold of a piece of straw off of the broom and used it to pick open his skin on his arm. He drew smiley faces and blood all over his walls. I've also seen guys write things with poop and fling poop on the walkways. LOL, we had one in for child essaying. They generally stick them in Seg because in Gen Pop, they get their ass kicked on a regular basis. He'd like to fake being unconscious so he could go to medical. It gave him a change of scenery. Well, the nurse got tired of his crap and decided to stick a catheter in next time he did it. He woke the F up with a scream, never did it again. They also sometimes set fire to their cells to get some time out. Usually just ended up pissing all the other inmates off because they'd have to deal with the smoke. Oh, watched another officer get his finger bit off by an inmate. He and I were in a physical struggle with him, and we lost. We were much smaller than the inmate. He was eventually subdued when our backup arrived, but it seemed to take forever. I wasn't harmed, but I caught a lot of crap from that other officer for not having his back. I totally had his back. Not my fault he put his finger anywhere close enough for that inmate to bite it. Sorry, I keep remembering more. Was shown a video of the kitchen staff reaching into their pants to put pubic hair into the food. Nasty. Story 44. It's been almost 20 years since I worked in a maximum security jail as a guard. The one story that sticks with me the most is when they brought in a 20-something male straight from intake to a normal holding cell by himself, as we didn't have any open beds in the mental health unit. He wasn't a big guy, but something about him was creepy. I was in the control room watching him when he began hitting his head against the wall. I exited control and went over to his cell and began talking to him. It was as if he had 10 personalities. He'd switch between crying child to angry teen to whimpering woman sounding to a voice that sounded evil. It was some language I'd never heard and just plain sounded evil, as in devil evil. Me being a dumbass boot, asked him when he was in that tongue, "Are you the devil?" "I have many names." "Well, if you are the devil, I think the devil's a pussy." That was not a good idea. He went into a rage and began hitting himself all over the walls, drawing blood. I called my supervisor and we set up an extraction team. 5 of us suited up and went in with a shield. 5 of us big guys. And the devil kicked our ass. I mean, beat the crap out of us. He felt no pain and had superhuman strength. We finally got him hogtied, but not before we all got our asses handed to us. He tested negative for PCP. Story 45. I used to rent a room from 2 prison guards who worked at a maximum security prison. I asked them this, and they told me a story about this man who was like 65. He had joined the army and went into the special forces. Did really well, but when he left, he realized he wasn't good at anything else. So he became a hitman because he was good at killing. But in prison, apparently he was all right and respectful, despite being able to easily kill most of the people there. One day, an Indian man was brought in, no idea what for, sees the old hitman and just goes nuts, screaming at him, "You SA'd my mother! I'll effing kill you! You're my dad and I'll kill you! You know you did it! You came to India in 1978! Not actual date, I can't remember. "And SA'd my mother!" Apparently the old army dude got him to the floor in seconds, looked up confused as crap. All the other guards had run over, because they thought for certain the Indian guy was dead, and the old man just shrugged and said, "Could someone tell him I've never been to India?" Story 47. Chasing a homeless guy around a cell block because he was going through DTs, hallucinating, and riding his motorcycle to get away from us. Another guy on something good climbing the vestibule bars like a spider, in his words. One guy mentally just broke one day, sat in isolation cell calling his literal cat in Mexico on his cell phone, would throw his food in the toilet and eat his feces. Watched him knock over my sergeant, who was my powerlifting coach, like she was a bowling pin. She had multiple state records at the time in bench press, deadlift, and squat. Took 6 of us to hold him down to get the taser darts out of him. That had zero effect. We fought him 2 to 3 times a day for a week before transferring him. Transportation officers promise him a McDonald's cheeseburger and milkshake if he's good. He goes to being the sweetest inmate you've ever seen and perfectly complied with every order. Saw a man blow a .27 on breathalyzer that was walking, talking, everything perfectly. Tried stopping a man from eating a fist-sized bag of cocaine. It was crushed up soap. I couldn't get to him before he ate it all. One man beat another guy with his fists in a stand-up fair fight. After knocking him out, proceeded to bash his head into the concrete floor. Blood was literally everywhere, puddles of it. The victim lived and was fine a few months later. The fight was over changing the TV station. Story 48. So a few years back, I was confinement supervisor. We had orderlies, inmates, working for us, and I usually interviewed the biggest workers because they were less likely to be convinced to bring contraband to work by other inmates in confinement. So Monk was jacked like Arnold Arms, was also a barber in the hallway. Well, this skinny inmate was doing time in confinement, always running his mouth and talking crap to Monk. No threats, just Uncle Tom comments. Monk would reply, "See me when you get out." So, of course, the day comes. Skinny gets out of confinement, walks straight to the barber shop and says, "What's up now?" Next, Monk walks into confinement, says, "Lock me up, Sarge, I killed him." I'm like, what? Then, over the radio master control, announced inmate down in a building, so secure him in a shower with other staff present, and get to the scene where Skinny is laying there, eyes rolled, drooling, as medical arrived and asked what happened. He doesn't know? There were no other witnesses. I go back to confinement and ask Monk, "What the F? Did you punch him?" He said, "No, Sarge, I slapped him." You know what? I slapped. He came into the barbershop talking crap, so I slapped him. I know I could have submitted a statement, but there were no witnesses, and I think Skinny learned his lesson. Story 49. So, as a disclaimer, I myself am not a prison guard, but my father is. And through him, I've heard some horror stories. He works at the Marionville State Penitentiary in PA, which is considered as one of the most violent in PA. They have an inmate in there nicknamed the Spaghetti Man. He earned this nickname by killing his girlfriend and turning her into meatballs, which he then served to her family. His job mainly consists of working in the yard and calling lines. Think elementary school in the cafeteria when they would call you to get your food table by table. But instead of kids, it's 200 murderers all walking towards you at once. Here are a few of those stories, and just for the record, I may be a little biased, but he's one of the toughest and most badass mother effers I know. This fact, coupled with the way he handles himself around and to the inmates, has earned him a lot of respect from them. 1. He got a call on his radio of a fight breaking out in the showers. He doesn't know it at the time, but it was a gang-on-gang fight. As he's sprinting down the hallway, he can hear the sounds of the brawl with people yelling and whatnot. He turns the corner and runs into the shower, immediately slipping and falling on his back, knocking the wind out of him. Looking up, he sees that he didn't just slip on water, he slipped on what he described as, quote, "the bloodiest scene I've ever seen in my life." What was normally supposed to be white tile was covered completely, up to every inch in blood. He picked himself up, and by then, a couple other officers had shown up, and they got the situation taken care of. If I remember correctly, 17 inmates were sent directly to urgent care, and numerous more were sent to the infirmary ward on site. 2. Lucky he's never been severely hurt. That being said, he once got stabbed through his right hand with a sharpened toothbrush. He was effectively acting as a lunch monitor when he noticed a bunch of inmates staging, when inmates strategically placed themselves in position to perform a hit. He read the situation and booked it over to the guy who was the target. Lucky he got there just in time to push the target out of the way. Unlucky the shank missed the guy and went straight through my dad's hand. Remember when I said my dad had earned a lot of respect over the years? Well, it comes into play here. He said the look of fear on the attacker's face was priceless. He wasn't the type of guy that normally would have been put off by stabbing a guard. It was which guard it was that scared him. He was afraid, and rightfully so, that other inmates would be pissed at him for stabbing my dad. Apparently, there were a few inmates that came up to my dad afterwards and asked him, "Do you want me to get him, Sarge? 'Cause I'll get him." Of course, my dad said no. 3. He's seen fights happen in the yard that were so bloody that the ground became too saturated to soak up the blood anymore. This should show you how much blood was in that shower from the first story, and the shower had drains. And 4, earlier on in his career, he overheard a couple inmates who were in a gang, I believe MI6, talking about a hit they were going to do tomorrow in the yard. My dad walked up to the leader and asked him if there was going to be a problem. This turned into a conversation my dad had shoulder to shoulder with a big-name member of the gang, like they literally worshiped the guy, as they took a stroll and talked. "Is there going to be a problem in my yard tomorrow, sir?" "Excuse me?" "I asked if there's a problem I should know about." "And what the F makes you think I'd tell you?" "I don't think you will, but there better not be any effing problems in my yard." "Do you know who you're talking to?" "I don't give a F who I'm talking to, and what you do anywhere else is not my concern. But there better not be any problems in my yard." Skip to the next day, and my dad called the guy over. "So, is there going to be a problem today?" "No, Sergeant. You said you didn't want any problems in your yard, so there's not going to be any problems in your yard." "I appreciate that. Now, is there going to be any problems in the next shift?" "Sergeant, I don't know about that." His shift ends with no problems, but spoiler alert, some poor guy got killed in the next one. 5. Now, technically the guards aren't allowed to interact with the inmates like this, but my dad had earned enough respect that no one really cared. Some of the inmates in the yard were arm wrestling each other, and this one guy was kicking everyone's ass. He was a 6'8", 320 pounds mountain of meat. My dad and a couple of his buddies were watching when the inmates called for him to come over. The big dude challenged my 5'10", 230-pound dad to come over. Again, I'd like to point out that this guy is the toughest mother effer I've ever met. He won the Iron Man award during his 4-year stint in the Navy. So my dad sits down and accepts this guy's challenge. Long story short, my dad ends up dislocating this guy's elbow to the shock of everyone around him. I'll add more as I remember them, and I'll ask him for some I may not have heard. Feel free to ask any questions. Story 50. I'm not a prison guard, but I work in maintenance, and a coworker used to work at the remand center. He told me about this one. Bad dude was brought in for violent assault and was put in a cell with a mentally ill street person who was in for routine vagrancy sort of stuff. Bad dude decides in the middle of the night that he wants to kill MISP. He beats the poor MISP to death and then spends an hour or two basically stomping on the poor guy's head and doing WWE jumps off the bunk onto the poor guy's body. Guards were slacking off on cameras and rounds, so it wasn't noticed for a couple hours. The MISP had literally no head left. Body was like a bag of parts with every bone smashed and literally no head, just a pile of muck everywhere. The scene was so bad that they removed the body and everyone refused to clean up. Regular janitorial wouldn't touch it, and they couldn't get a contractor for a day or two, so the facility manager asked maintenance guys if any of them would clean up. After initially refusing, they were offered triple time and several paid days off. Friend agreed as no one else would, and he said he, quote, couldn't just leave the poor guy there like that. My friend and another guy spent several hours cleaning the poor man up and had to use dustpans to scoop up the blood and skull and brain matter. The cells are watertight for the bottom few inches, so he said it was literally blood and brain matter about 2 inches deep. I wouldn't have gone near it for $1 million for what he described. He was clearly traumatized from doing this, but building operators are true effing unsung heroes, and often are the last person not my job rolls down to, so he did it. I felt so sorry for him, but massive respect as well. He didn't do it for the money or days off. He did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. Story 51. Worked at a theater internment facility in Iraq. Housed a couple thousand prisoners the U.S. coalition forces in Iraq deemed criminal threats. We had a riot where the detainees made improvised Molotovs out of water bottles, mattress foam, and hand sanitizer. Crap was like napalm. Hearing them chant, Muqtada, Muqtada, Uala, Uala, made the effing air vibrate. Then we got the detainees from Buka and Taji. Big mother effer. Well over 6 feet tall walked in, grabbed an old man and threw him into the sea wire. His reason? The old man was working with terrorists and that we should trust him. We didn't trust him. Detainees were also creative as F. One had hidden contraband in an ice cooler. The contraband? Hand-stitched prison clothes made to look like civilian shirts and pants. Hand-dyed with pen ink, complete with a Nike swoosh. They even made a baseball cap out of a sleeping mattress and cardboard. They got Coca-Cola with their evening meal. They like to destroy notes in the Coke. One guy went to open a bottle during inspection to retrieve a note. The bottle erupted when he unscrewed it. Turns out the detainee had also jacked off into it. Story 52. Geez, I could go on forever with this one. Feces smeared all over walls and cross patterns and the words, "Help me," spelled out in poop letters covering an entire cell wall. A guy self-pleasuring with a broomstick up his arse. A guy shooting his load into a cup over and over all night before finally dipping a finger in and giving it a taste. Must have enjoyed the taste, cause he then proceeded to chug the entire cup. He was on psych restrictions in a single-man camera cell, so all this was observed on camera. The most extreme would probably be finding a guy dead and hanging with a sheet around his neck. Our facility first responders, along with EMS, worked on him for 26 minutes and got a pulse. Ended up brain dead and his family pulled the plug. Never a dull day working in a prison, that's for sure. Saw a guy shove a 1x2-inch shard of glass into the skin in the top of his chicken. Another guy stuck a toothbrush, bristles first, all the way up his chicken. On holidays, the inmates at my facility get special meals, usually like a quarter of a chicken, burgers and brats, turkey and ham, Thanksgiving, and things like that. Said meals were always accompanied by one of those 24-ounce bottles of Pepsi, Mountain Dew, etc. Guy stopped me and with a straight face said, quote, "I think I need to go to the hospital. I just shoved a pop bottle in my a-hole." Thought he meant partly, or that he crinkled it up first. Nope, whole bottle, with the lid on, completely gone into his ass. So I'm learning a lot about human anatomy reading through some of these stories. It seems like these objects and the places that they're finding themselves within people defies the laws of physics, but apparently it's possible. That's absolutely grotesque. Story 54. I'm a CO in the state of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The most extreme thing I've ever experienced was the beating of an inmate in my cell block. Context, I've always been easygoing with the inmates, and one of them, let's call him Raymond, was a guy who clearly was there for political reasons. He was sort of a left activist. Police officers invaded his house and arrested him and his wife for weed possession, which doesn't send you to jail in Brazil. Anyway, he was a Foo Fighters fan and he played the guitar, so sometimes we talked about guitar playing and rock music in general. He wasn't aware of how he should behave in prison, so I always tried to keep another inmate close to us so he would see Raymond wasn't snitching or anything like that. Raymond had a stupid lawyer who would always show up after lockup, and that made the general population think Raymond was a snitch anyway. A few months went by, tensions rising little by little. On a visitation day, an inmate's sister was arrested for trying to smuggle a few hundred grams of cocaine concealed in her genitals. Just a few moments after said inmate was informed and taken to solitary, Raymond was walking with some other inmates and gave me a thumbs up, which is a common greeting here, and I replied by doing the same gesture. Some inmates saw that as a confirmation of sorts and proceeded to beat him as soon as visitation time was over and we started locking the cells. We were heavily understaffed, so I had to leave my cell block to watch out for my colleague while he locked his. That's when the beating started. Lots of shouting and noise. But I couldn't leave my colleague unwatched. It went on for at least 5 minutes, and by the time I finally got him out of there, he was so hurt I thought he would die right there. His forehead was extremely swollen, as was the back of his head, and he was bleeding a bit. After my colleagues took him to the infirmary, I proceeded to lock my cell block. 2 cells in and a fight broke out. The inmates who were beating Raymond started a fight with the inmates who helped take him out of the cell block. It was like 20-30 people fighting one another. So there I was, alone in the middle of over 300 inmates, watching a few dozen fighting right before me. If anybody there had something against me, that would have been the perfect opportunity for them to hit me or something. Nothing happened, thankfully. Some inmates managed to end the fight and I locked everyone without problem. After finishing lockup, I went to see Raymond. His head and face were still very swollen, and his body was covered in bruises and a few cuts. He started crying and thanked me, even though I believe he only got beaten because we talked more often than what would be advisable in the first place. A few days later, he was transferred to a safer prison, and a few months later, he was found innocent. Raymond almost died for absolutely no reason. 2 quick extra stories. 1. Years before I started working in my current unit, a snitch was trapped and stabbed over 200 times. Everyone in the cell block was forced to stab him at least once, so nobody would be sent to the hole. 2. In the unit management office, there's a computer with a folder full of pictures of dead inmates. A guy who tried to run away and got shot in the head. Guys who unalived themselves and hurt their wrists. I get why such pictures would need to be taken. What I don't get is why there would be a folder full of them for anyone to see. Story 55. Not prison, but county lockup. There was a guy, let's call him Blood, who had been chained back from the pen to face new charges. He was already doing life, but they were trying to put another body on him. Blood wasn't a particularly big guy, but every inmate in the tank knew to leave him alone because he had literally nothing to lose. Enter CO Green. CO Green fancied himself a hard-nosed guard. He was the son of a recently retired corrections officer, but unlike his father before him, he cared nothing for building rapport with his charges, and instead of mutual respect, he opted for a policy of intimidation. Respect is the only currency that means anything on the outside. Everyone despised CO Green, but because it was jail and not prison, No one was willing to square off for fear of catching a new charge and being sent up. Blood did not have this problem. The way that the jail pods are set up where I live, 5 separated tanks that form a wheel around a central guard terminal. Each tank has a day room, showers, and a phone bank. There are 14 two-man cells on the ground level and stairs on either end that lead up to a second tier of 14 cells. The second tier is maybe 20 feet from the ground. One day, I was playing spades in the day room, and as we were getting ready to lock down for count, CO Green has been assigned to our unit for his shift. He comes in and tells everybody to go to their cells. On the upper tier, Blood decides he doesn't want to lock down because he didn't have a chance to use the phone. Now, this is where an experienced CO would handle the situation with some tact. He would know the threat level of the inmates in his pod and radio the riot squad to prep before attempting any kind of confrontation. Not CO Green. Green said something like, "I don't give a F. Lock down now or you're going to the hole." Blood says, "I've been going to your wife's hole for years, mother effer." We all got quiet as Green turned beet red and charged up the stairs. "Last chance, female dog," turned out to be the last words he'd say to an inmate that day. I didn't see the punch that broke Green's nose, or Blood throwing him off the rail, but I was well positioned to see Green's body as it fell 20 feet to the concrete below. Blood had time to run down and stomp him a few times before the goon squad came in and pepper sprayed everybody. They had to stretcher Green out of the unit. He eventually recovered, but was never the same. Green became known as Teardrop. I heard he lasted about a month and quit. Blood had about 50 years tacked on to his non-existent release date and was sent on his merry way. Some people just don't care. Story 56. I apologize ahead of time for how long this is. Never worked at a prison, but I did work at a facility that housed children and teens under lock and key. The ages were 5 to 18, with various mental health and developmental disabilities. Some spent their whole lives in residential facilities due to families giving them up, and most were unadoptable due to severe aggressive behaviors. It takes a special family to adopt some of these kids, and most just aged out of the system and end up homeless or in group homes. The majority of teens, though, were conduct disorder, and instead of putting them in juvenile detention, the state started putting them in our facility. Funding just wasn't there to give these kids real skills and mental health care. It was sad and frustrating work. Loved the kids. Hated the politics of it all. Once hired a former police officer that quit the same day due to how depressing it is. Anyways, I'll get to the point. The facility was basically a compound with several cottages, each housing 8 to 10 kids. The cottages were separated by sex, mental capacity, mental health, and/or conduct disorder. There was an intensive care unit which housed mixed sex, but all these kids had severe health issues, such as manic depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc. These kids had homicidal and wanting to self-unalive ideation. Another cottage consisted of teenage girls who were caught in drug/sex trafficking. At the time, Cleveland, Ohio, was the second in the nation in human sex trafficking. I worked in the all-girls cottage that mostly dealt with developmental disabilities. There were mental health issues mixed in there too. The cottage next to us was an all-girls conduct disorder unit. Most of these girls were runaways and truants. The girls weren't bad, just came from terrible home situations. A lot of them were SA'd as children, with zero adult figures in their life to help them through their trauma. All these kids just had really crappy starts to life and/or never had a chance due to severe mental disability. I have so many stories. Many stick out to me, but my absolute most effed up story is when a staff member killed a kid in the unit next to us. Watching as the EMT workers take the body out of the cottage will forever be ingrained in my memory. The next day I quit. My staff worker sat on the child's back until she suffocated. The kid was a small 16-year-old female. Many staff warned our coordinators months ahead of this incident that this specific cottage was a problem. Staff acted like the kids. They teased each other, and there were constant fights with the kids and the staff in his cottage. It was a terrible situation. Our pleas to switch up the cottage culture were ignored, and then this happened. It was completely preventable if anyone just paid the F attention. What started the fight, which resulted in her death, was that the girl snatched a scarf off of a staff member's neck. The staff then proceeded to put the child in an improper restraint in prone position and put all her weight on the back of the girl, which caused the girl to start struggling to breathe. The struggles were met with even more pressure. The girl even vomited, but the staff kept sitting on her until she finally stopped breathing. Once the child stopped moving, the staff got up and left her in the room, assuming the kid just passed out. 3 hours later, they realized she never came back to join the other kids. They found her in the same room they left her in, dead and in rigor mortis. Did they call 911? Nope, they called the campus nurse. The nurse immediately called 911. If any of you worked in any of these kinds of facilities in Ohio, this is the case that changed restraints to supine position instead of prone. 3 of the staff members were charged for negligent homicide, but were found not guilty. How can that be? Because the jurors assumed that the kid caused her own death for antagonizing the staff. Absolute bullcrap. I was so disgusted. About a year or 2 after I left, staff members were caught sex trafficking the girls in a different cottage, with girls as young as 13. Thankfully, the facility has now shut down. Story 57. Not a guard, an inmate, and not prison, just county jail, but saw a CO tase a young guy, probably less than 20, in the mouth for backtalking. Kid just started vomiting everywhere and had to be carried out of the dorm. Never saw him again, but was only there for a couple weeks. Another time, I was actually in a temporary holding/detention adjacent to the courthouse and was in a cell with a bunch of guys while we waited for arraignment. This old, super worn out guy who could barely walk refused to stand up when a CO told him to. The guard was this huge, roided out effer, just unlocks the cell and comes in and starts slamming this old guy's face into the wall. A bunch of us started to yell and ask for help. He was just pounding the crap out of this old guy's face. No one came, and finally the guard carried him out of the cell. Don't know what happened to him. I've spent maybe a month total in county and saw both these things happen in that short time span. That's Portland, Oregon. It's not always the inmates behaving badly. Again, I wasn't around long, but in the dorms I was in, everyone was insanely chill. This is mostly low-level offenders whose crimes didn't result in a prison sentence, so a lot of possession charges and other relatively benign stuff. Story 58. Not my story. I went to a Jesuit college. One of the priests told this story about how he almost left the priesthood but stayed, telling it in his voice. When I first got out of the seminary, I started working at a prison counseling youths. One day, while I was there, a commotion happened in the corner and a bunch of inmates were starting to SA another inmate. I yelled at them to stop, and much to my astonishment, they did. I started talking again with the youth I was assigned to when his eyes went wide. The group that was assaulting the other inmate now surrounded my table. While I was sitting there, I heard someone standing next to me clear their throat. I turned my head and found the biggest, blackest cock I've ever seen right in front of me. Looking up at the inmate, he looked down at me and said, "Now, what do you suppose I can do with this?" Scared out of my mind, a million things ran through my brain, and I believe it was only through divine providence that I said the correct one. I looked at his chicken, looked back at his face, and said calmly, "If you bend over ever so slightly, you could F yourself in the ass with it." There was a moment of silence, and then an explosion of laughter by all the other inmates. Then the inmate in front of me started laughing, pulled up his pants, and walked away. And that, boys, is why I remained a priest. Story 59. Work colleague of mine who previously used to work in a juvenile detention center before working at an office. This story that he told me over drinks one night after work is probably the reason why. He was doing the rounds around the block and basically was approached by the warden to escort a first-time inmate to a cell. From his description, it was a slender boy who was apparently in prison for offensive aggravated assault and robbery or something. Was funny considering how thin he described the kid, like apparently borderline anorexic. Was that he was in for that. Basically, as he was walking him to his cell, he got up with chatting with him and making him feel comfortable and that it wasn't that bad, and even got a smile out of him. Unfortunately, a couple of days later, as he came back in and overheard an inmate had been gang SA'd and beaten into a coma. After they were done, they apparently went as far as to shove a toothbrush/razor blade shiv up his ass. As you maybe figured out, it was that kid. Apparently, after that incident a week later, he straight up quit. Went home and just literally pondered his whole existence. Said he still hasn't gotten over it. Story 60. Not me, but my father worked in a maximum security prison in Perth, WA, Casuarina. Late 1990s. They decided not to allow prisoner visits on Xmas Day. My understanding is this meant less guards in the prison so they could be home with their families rather than convicted criminals having Xmas visits. Didn't go down too well. I was about 18 at the time. We sat at my sister-in-law's house waiting for him to finish work, but he never turned up for the Xmas party. We called his work and no one answered for hours. We heard on the news the entire prison had rioted with a drastically understaffed roster. My dad relayed a memory where he and a few others were being chased and running for their lives from a mob of prisoners across the exercise field, and as he turned back to gauge the danger, he likened the sky to the scene in Braveheart, where the sky was dark and filled with arrows. Only it was bricks, chunks of concrete, star pickets, pool balls, and anything else they could tear apart as a weapon and throw at them. It lasted many hours, way longer than a normal kickoff, because the riot squad were also rostered off for Xmas and they all had to come from home. Netflix has a short doco about it, with some pretty scary crap. He told me some more gruesome tales about the lifers in the special handling unit, but that's their story. Story 61. I worked in a mental health unit. It was frequent to see cut veins, abdominal rips, and I've had to wade through blood to rescue an inmate who attempted self-unaliving on multiple occasions. Probably the worst I've seen involved an inmate who liked to take areas hostage. The way our rules worked, we had to suit up to get him. He would grab the metal IV pole and swing it at anyone who tried to come in the room. I talked him down and he got a shot of haloperidol. A few weeks later, he was out for a shower, kicked the lock off the shower and took control of a wing. We had to run an extraction team to get him, while another team came in the back door, and we all got a good tongue lashing for that. The inmates knew it had to be life or death to use chemical agents in the mental health unit. They took advantage of that. I suffered a few concussions in my 6 years, had to have stitches, I was bitten twice, and I went on antiretrovirals because they claimed HIPAA prevented him from telling me if the person who bit me was carrying anything. Worst I've heard of was at the same camp. Officer was 3 years in, approximately 30 years ago now. He went to break up an altercation, and the inmate swung around and slashed his throat. He nearly bled out before anyone could help him. He just retired 4 years ago. He did nearly his whole 30 years in a guard tower protecting the delivery gate. He spent more than 2 decades with no inmate contact, but he went back to work before his stitches were even removed. I remember wondering why someone who was so meek would ever be a CO. Then I got the story and I was amazed. I would have never come back. Period. Story 62. I remember painting cells in reception in Elmira Prison. I was in a double-bunked cell in A block. The block was made up of almost 400-some cells, 45 cells on each row, 2 rows on each tier, and 4 tiers total. My bunkie's name was K. We were in cell 8-2, 8th tier, 2nd cell. The first 2 cells in each row were double-bunked. Elmira Prison is a unique and terrible place. Rats running rampant and birds flying and chilling. The sound of 400 people communicating, yelling, and screaming. People fishing in innovative and mesmerizing ways. There's a never-ending smell of cigarettes and burning toilet paper in the air. Everyone would smoke inside. Even the COs would walk down the hall smoking cigarettes and flick their cigarettes on the ground when they were done. When you first arrive, you have to walk on this painted yellow line with 20-some other people. Everyone's hair freshly shaved off and 40 cells above you screaming fresh meat and throwing stuff and shaking cells. The guy in front of me when I first arrived got hit with a cup of water. Ugh, poor guy. Anyways, me and Kay were painting cells in Tier 8. Everyone called the CO on that floor Peter Griffin, and he was an ass. But yeah, we got to get out of the cell. There was a third older guy painting as well. We were issued paint scrapers. We had misplaced one, and the CO overheard us talking about it. It literally hadn't been gone for more than a couple minutes. Instead of the CO approaching the situation rationally, he threw us up against the wall. Another CO joined him. He kicked my feet apart violently and then used his pointer finger knuckle to push as hard as he could into the pressure point behind my left ear, lifting me off my feet and onto my toes, yelling at my stupidity and threatening me with acts of violence. I didn't see what happened to my bunkie, but I could guess. They took us into separate cells. The CO tried to shove me to the ground, and when he couldn't, he took his baton thing and hit my knees and backs of the legs so I would buckle. He then repeatedly punched me in the kidneys? The side of my body yelling at me and how I'm a dumb F and I better find that paint scraper, smashing my face into the floor. I could hear Kay getting hit from another cell. There is an eerie silence from the cells around us. They brought Kay into the cell, closed the gate, and then went to go get the sergeant or whatever. The paint scraper was about a foot away from where I got beat on my bunkie's bed in plain view. This is nothing extraordinary. Much worse things happen than this. FCOs that beat inmates. Psychopaths. There's so much wrong with incarceration of human beings. Also, I have periuresis, shy bladder syndrome. In my opinion, the single most terrible affliction to have in jail or prison. Literally no privacy ever. I'd been monitored urine screened since I was 14, and one of the reasons I was in prison was having problems providing monitored urine screens. Anyways, I ended up doing 104 days in the box for not being able to provide urine. If you trust a human so little you have to watch them go pee, there's literally no point in what you're doing. That relationship is broken and won't be fixed. LOL. Don't know if any of this made sense. Story 63. Not so much a prison story, but a county jail story. So at one point when I was 20, I couldn't afford to pay my fine, so I had to do some jail time. But the jail was full, so they had me do it in blocks, where I was at home at night but would spend the day in jail for like 2 to 3 weeks. Anyways, they had a handful of us in what they called boats, which were basically just big rooms with a metal table around the wall and stools used for transferring prisoners between jails. The wall along the hallway outside was basically all glass, and on the other side of this narrow hallway is lined with solitary confinement cells for self-unaliving watch prisoners and people dealing with withdrawals. They don't give two craps in this county. It's a real problem. People have died in this jail because they just threw them in a cell and forced them to go cold turkey. They even tased an old man to death one time there, but that's a different story for another time. So anyways, each of these solitary rooms are probably about the size of a large bathroom stall, with a concrete slab bed and a toilet/fountain combo. The door is about a foot thick and looks almost like a bank vault door with a 7x5 window. Some real solid doors. So now that I've painted the picture for you, it's maybe my second day doing this, and they put this scruffy looking dude on what they call a self-unaliving dress, which is basically a green padded robe, kinda looks like gym mats, and put this guy in one of the confinement rooms directly across from us. So this guy eventually basically becomes a zoo exhibit for us as his condition begins to deteriorate throughout the day. Some of the guys even try messing with him laughing. I didn't, because I knew if that dude got the chance, he would effing wreck these guys that were having a laugh, and he wouldn't feel a thing. So it's after dinner time now, and the guy has started trying to find a way out. I sat and watched him for about an hour trying to pull apart the mirror, using a plastic knife to try and dig around it until it breaks. He even tried to dig with his fingernails. He moved on from the mirror to the door, starts pushing and digging his nails around the edge of the window, trying to move the door with no luck. This thing was solid and not moving whatsoever until he realizes it's not working. He takes a step back and starts banging his head against the door, over, and over. And what was really scary is he actually started making progress. This door that wouldn't even wiggle before then actually began to shake, and the window visibly shaking. You could even start to hear things inside the door start to rattle around, like he managed to break something. Eventually, he started bleeding before someone finally noticed, and a group of about 10 to 15 deputies had to come and actually open the door and actually tie him down. As I was signing out for the day, I asked the sheriff, "Look, I know you aren't allowed to tell me what's wrong with that dude, but obviously something's up. What's his deal?" Her response, "That's what coming down off a lifetime of 2/5 of Jack Daniels a day looks like." I couldn't even fathom it, but considering the state my town was in at the time, I wasn't necessarily surprised either. Bonus story. I would later see this guy again less than a year later in the same jail. For the same reason, separate occasion. Except this time not as effed, but it's like 3 in the morning this time and I'm doing blocks but in the opposite order. I get up to get some water at like the perfect moment to hear some guy at intake down the hallway scream, "F you, let me call my lawyer. F you, pig, give me my phone. F this." So if you lean against the glass, you can see down the hallway. You can see intake, and I look at the perfect moment to hear "F this" and see this dude begin to run as the fattest deputy I've ever seen tried to chase him. So I'm already dying, trying not to laugh and wake everyone up. Then I see them take the dude and he drops hard, and the fat cop does this little bunny hop and lands on him as the rest of the deputies begin to dogpile and hog tie him. I climb in bed so I don't get yelled at. I see them carry him like the Ewoks did Luke Skywalker and tie him down in one of those solitary rooms, the whole time screaming, cursing these cops out. "F you pigs, fight me." So after they tie him down and I hear him struggling down the hall and it finally goes silent for about a minute, then suddenly, "F you pigs, you can't contain me. I have the power. Ah!" I effing lose it. I laughed so hard everyone woke up asking what the F happened. I think I eventually managed to get sleep, but that dude pretty much spent the rest of the night screaming for his wife or something, who 10 minutes later was brought in and pretty much did the same thing, short of running and getting tased, but they were finally able to get her to calm down, at least not long after. Story 64. I worked at a juvie shelter during investigations when there were some fights or when a kid complained about their rights being violated. It was one step down from the juvie prison. There was a mix of kids who were truant too many times to kids who committed assault. Our building was 3 stories, and one kid was able to take a heating AC unit off the wall and escape. The unit was against the floor on the bottom. He had his roommates act as a lookout and distract staff over a 2-week period. Staff are low paid and most often were a warm body to maintain some supervision. For the most part, if the kids weren't fighting, then all they had to do was maintain that. After it was discovered that he escaped, a search was conducted and we found a plan he had drawn out. His room was on the 2nd floor, so we had to scale down and cross the rooftop of a couple of other buildings nearby to avoid the fence. He made a rope out of bed sheets and everything. It was like the kid version of Shawshank Redemption. I was really impressed by his motivation and ingenuity. I wasn't even mad at him. The kids were products of their neighborhoods, and most of them had experienced some level of trauma. I wish he had the opportunity to apply that level of dedication in an environment that would have set him up for success. Story 65. I was an officer for over 5 years. Top 3 in no particular order. Spooning. Not the usual little and small spoon, just one big spoon inserted into the anus to scoop out your insides and cause horrible pain and long-term implications. This was used as a way of asserting dominance and embarrassment to the victim. Gym incident. While an inmate was mid-bench press, another inmate smashed a 25 kg weight onto his forehead. He survived with a metal plate, deformed head, and some mild brain damage. Kitchen incident. An argument over nothing led to a prisoner being stabbed several times with a huge kitchen knife that went in the back and virtually out the other side, also into the armpit and legs. Waves of blood throughout the kitchen. He was helicoptered out and sitting up in bed laughing the next day. That's just a quick few. We came to the conclusion that they can't kill each other. Inmates only died of natural or self-induced causes. So many more times we saw similar things, and every time they survived with minimal damage. Story 66. I only worked in a medium security prison. Most of our inmates went out on work details around our county and surrounding counties, cutting grass, building maintenance, stuff like that. But because of their work details, we had a huge problem with contraband being brought in. They were strip searched every time they left the facility and came back in. Anyway, one day, somehow somebody let it slip that an inmate was going to be carrying in a delivery in his ass so he couldn't be caught at the strip search. So when he came in, he was put on the bucket. This treatment consisted of the inmate being put in one of the ISO/admin seg showers with a 5-gallon bucket, roll of toilet paper, drinking laxatives, and an officer watching until he crapped at least one time and the officer could confirm that there wasn't any contraband in the bucket afterwards. So this dude gets to crapping and it's going the usual route. Nothing to cause suspicion, I mean. He's just doing his business and wiping, but the officer noticed every time he was wiping, he was having trouble. Eventually they realized he had been crapping around this contraband and told him he could either crap it out himself or they'd take him to the hospital where he'd get some type of scan to see if he had anything, and if he did, he'd be paying the costs on top of catching an outside charge. So he complied and proceeded to remove an object about 7 inches in length and curved like a sausage from his ass. It was wrapped in electrical tape and cellophane and had some weed, mostly tobacco and a few Xanax inside. It just blew my mind that this guy had become so gifted at bringing this stuff that he could now crap around the contraband. Story 67. My first day, I was given a Polaroid camera and I took pictures of the 3-inch gash in the head of an inmate who got hit with a padlock and a sock. We had this Navy SEAL who, despite making a brief stop in AC with us, ended up taking a hostage and swearing to kill anyone who came in. Fortunately, he did it at count time, so everybody was already rolled in. I was in a pod about 200 yards away and could feel the tear gas. My inmates were complaining of their eyes and noses burning, but they knew what was going on. Everybody went home alive that night. We had 2 inmates get drunk and argue about something. One of them gets a mop bucket and beats the other one's brains out with the wringer. He then began cleaning the cell up and went quietly when the yard man came to get him. Central Office ran a shakedown of our facility. They handled all the inmates' piss cups, emptied every cell onto the pod floor, ran dogs through the parking lot, etc. 6 COs were walked out by state police. They found about a half pound of weed, more than an ounce of junk, and a wide variety of shanks. My pod had only 2 contraband violations. I was proud of my boys. I got a million of them. I just kind of stopped telling people what it's like. They frequently don't believe me anyway. Story 68. Not me, but my father. He was a CO at USP Lewisburg for over a decade, and during the post 9/11 years, where I can imagine there was some serious racial tension. One story he told me still makes me squirm. Apparently, while Lewisburg is high security, they had some pretty serious inmates, from terrorist suspects to higher-ups in gangs, the usual. Well, part of my dad's job was monitoring the flow of inmates back into the prison after their yard time. While doing checks on returning inmates, an Aryan Brotherhood member came up to him and suggested that, quote, if he had any vacation days, he should take a trip next week. As mentioned many times, there's a level of respect for COs from inmates, but my dad told me they would literally tell them that a hit is going to happen. Anyways, my dad said he had to report that, obviously, and on the CCTV recording, you could see my dad rear back in surprise when this guy whispered that crap in his ear. Believe it or not, that hit came. 4 Aryan guys jumped a Muslim as he was let out of a cell. It was over before anyone had a chance to help the guy. He was stabbed over 50 times before his attackers were taken off of him. It happened in the wing that my dad was watching, so he and his partners were responsible for assisting in getting the body out. He said they had a stretcher, but it was cross-stitched like a beach chair, if that makes sense. Anyways, when they went to move him onto the stretcher, my dad said he suctioned to the floor, and when they pulled him off, blood started pouring out like crazy. He said the worst part was carting this guy past the other Muslim inmates on that wing, blood running through the holes in the stretcher like a leaky faucet. Soon after, we moved up north, where he now works at a medium security prison and is up for retirement in a few years. Story 69. My dad was in prison in the 70s. He told me a few stories, but this is the one that stuck with me. So it's his first weekend, and he's put in a cell with a seasoned prisoner, somebody feared within the prison, but who kept himself to himself. Let's call this guy Jed. The first day, he doesn't say a word to my dad. No acknowledgement whatsoever. Bedtime comes, and my dad nervously gets in his bunk. He was at the bottom, insert pun here. An hour or so later, and just as my old man is drifting off, he feels a weight at the bottom of his bed, and sure enough, there's old Jed, sat patiently and staring at him. Before my dad can say a word, he slips his hand under the covers and grabs his thigh, at which point my father firmly and loudly but quite calmly grabs his wrist and states, "That's not me, man." The guy stares at him some more, removes his hand, and climbs back up to his bunk. The next day, my dad is in line to collect his tobacco and rations. As he purchases it and begins to walk away, he's immediately accosted by a group of prisoners looking to rob his smokes. A fight ensued, something else my dad told me about jail. Never back down. My dad is losing, and out of nowhere, old Jed comes steaming over, grabs the guy fighting the old man, slams him to the floor, and performs some kind of arm stamp which broke his arm and left him screaming in pain. After that, nobody gave my old man crap, and Jed was a friend throughout his time there. They kept up writing for a bit before losing touch. My old man's dead now, but I still wonder how old Jed is every now and then. Story 70. Not my story, but a story from a group of officers I was overseeing firearms qualification for in my law enforcement days that really stuck with me. Story was that they had a particularly disruptive inmate that was moved pretty consistently because he caused problems and made a lot of enemies who wanted to hurt him. One day, during one of those frequent moves, he grabbed a handful of his own crap while using the restroom and shoved it in his mouth and began to chew. He almost immediately began to vomit, so you had this man with crap and vomit spewing out of his mouth. They restrained him on the ground, but he began to smash his face into the bathroom floor, so now you had vomit, crap, and blood pouring out of his mouth and nose. At the point they lifted him up, he began to flail around, which flung all these things everywhere, including on all the officers holding him. He started yelling, "Now you've all got AIDS and herpes, 'cause I have AIDS and herpes. You can never touch your family again, 'cause if you do, I've infected them too." Or something to that effect. It's been 15 or so years since I've heard this story. Guy ends up being transferred out of the facility, but the officers involved were all tested for various things. One of them apparently got this stuff in his mouth. They said those tests were honestly horrifying, and one of the officers actually quit because of the event. Turns out, Guy didn't have AIDS, but he did have herpes and a slew of other STDs as well. Apparently, prisons are a hotbed for this. None of them ended up contracting anything, but just the fear of possibly getting something had to be so stressful. Story 71. Story from an old coworker, we'll call him B, who worked in a prison back in the 70s for a number of years. He was in charge of the kitchen at the time of this story. For a little bit of background, he told me that for several months he was having problems with kitchen staff stealing silverware, which for obvious reasons is pretty bad. His boss told him he needed to get it under control, but could never stop it all, until a new prisoner got transferred and they put him on kitchen duty. Apparently, this man was an enforcer for the KKK and was in for life for multiple murders. About 30 if you believe the guy. From what my B told me, from the start, the new guy was always nice and polite and kept to himself. So he decides that since he was an enforcer, he was going to put him in charge of the inmates in the kitchen and see if the stealing problem could be stopped. Sure enough, his first day on the job, B came into the kitchen and saw one of the inmates with a busted up bloody face, just scrubbing dishes and keeping his head down. When B looked over at the enforcer and asked what happened, he calmly looked at him and said, "He fell down, boss." B just laughed and said, "Well, think he'll fall down again?" To which the enforcer looked over at the other guy and said, "No, boss, I think he's figured out that he shouldn't fall again." B said, "All right, good to know." They never had another piece of silverware go missing the whole time he worked in that kitchen. I know this isn't really an extreme story, but it always made me laugh and wonder what else went on in prison in the 70s. Story 72. Not mine, but probably one of the more extremes. I was an inmate in the jail up until a week or so before this happened. It was all over the local news, with the jail being heavily criticized for this. I knew every inmate involved. This is what I either got told by other guards who seen the video or was in the press. There is a healthcare selection where they would put first-timers and other folks for various reasons. Very rarely due to actual physical issues, mostly mental. The healthcare cells have 4 beds in them and a toilet. The cells were checked every 15 minutes to make sure everything was okay. One of the reasons they put first-timers in there. So one day, a guy I barely knew, met a few times partying and whatnot, got held to wait for trial for SA. Being his first time in jail, he gets put into healthcare. Turns out, he was kinda known for being a dirty SA-er bastard. So that night after lockup, 2 of the 3 other guys decided to attack him. One of the 2 was already in for 2 separate murders, and the other was in the middle of a violent mental breakdown. They knocked the guy out with the first punch, jumped off the bed onto his head, boiled water and put sugar in it so it would stick to the skin, and poured it onto his face. Basically, they beat him to death and continued to beat it after he was dead. The guard heard the noise and went round and told them to stop, which they didn't do. There is a rule in the prison that for him to restrain a prisoner, there had to be 3 of them. In healthcare at that time, there was just 1 guard and a nurse. So the guard radioed for backup and had to stand there for a few minutes, watching the prisoner get beat to death while waiting for guards from all other sections arriving. Obviously, going in alone with 4 prisoners in the cell, with 2 of them murdering another one and 1 just sitting watching, would have been plain nuts. At the trial for the murder, the doctor at the local hospital said it was the worst beating he had ever seen. One of the guards told me later, and for a different thing, the guy's brains were going out through his nose. I don't know if that's actually true or not. The guard who watched it ended up leaving the service, and they made a bunch of changes to how healthcare prisoners were held, including making sure protection prisoners weren't in with the normal ones. Story 73. I'm not a prison guard, but I worked as a male registered nurse in psychiatric units for children and teenagers for 20 years. 6 of those years, I worked in a county juvenile probation department in locked detention units. The most extreme thing I saw in the detention unit was a 17-year-old who was brought to my clinic after having been green-lighted by a corrections officer and attacked by his peers. The kid was beaten pretty severely. Split up, black eyes, bruises all over his back, legs, and arms from being stomped while he was down. He covered his head and neck with his arms during the kicking. The corrections officer didn't like the victim because he talked back and mocked him. The kid talked crap to the other detainees too, and they already didn't like him. Quite a few of the corrections officers in this facility had a lot in common with the boys who were detained. They shared a lot of cultural values. They talked the same, liked the same music, dressed the same as the kids did when they weren't at work. In a phrase, they were all pretty ghetto-y and affected a gangsta-like attitude. It didn't take long for the authorities in the institution to realize the officer had given the other kids the green light. He was fired, and the county brought charges against him. There are very minimal opportunities for juvenile detention detainees to obtain weapons. Their environment is very controlled and constantly observed. much more so than in a prison or an adult jail. When I was in Marine Corps boot camp, I was the recruit platoon guide, sort of the head recruit, more or less. I was the oldest recruit in my platoon, at age 26, and I was actually 2 years older than the senior drill instructor, who was 24 years old. Had done 2 tours in Vietnam and had been wounded. He walked with a limp. One of our recruits was a tough black guy named Taylor. The platoon had a number of rather immature 17-year-old boys who were not yet very physically mature. The skinniest, weakest one was a white kid I'll call Smith. Taylor was a predatory homosexual, and like in prison, he kept trying to intimidate Smith and, quote, make him his female dog. Taylor would try to arrange things so that he and Smith were assigned to fire watch duty together at night. Smith would try to avoid Taylor, but Taylor was persistent. He tried to switch racks with another recruit so that he and Smith would be sleeping in adjacent bunks. While other recruits were aware of this, I was not. There were 98 recruits in our platoon, and my rack was on the other end of the squad bay from Taylor and Smith. On the day we were getting ready to graduate and leave boot camp, a young kid came up to me as we were standing in line to get our airplane tickets home and told me some disturbing news. Kid, the platoon's gonna kill Taylor tonight. Me, what? Kid, Taylor tried to SA Smith in the main room, the shower, while they were on fire watch. Smith managed to get away from him, but Taylor won't leave him alone. The platoon is going to kill Taylor in a blanket party tonight with a lock and a sock and a bunch of other weapons. This may seem bizarre and ridiculous to people reading this, but we had just finished 78 days of training designed to psychologically prepare recruits to use extreme violence to carry out attacks. I knew that the platoon was perfectly capable of doing exactly what Kid said. They knew how to prepare an ambush and exactly how to use available weapons to do it. You don't need a rifle to kill. The world is filled with lethal weapons. You don't kill with a rifle, you kill with a hard heart. I instantly realized that if they attacked Taylor, we would be stuck in boot camp for weeks longer for the investigation and multiple court-martials. To be honest, I didn't give a crap about Taylor. I just didn't want to be stuck in boot camp longer. I went to one of our assistant drill instructors, Sergeant Robinson, and told him. The platoon was whispering back and forth in line, probably about going home. Sergeant Robinson quietly said, "Follow my lead," then launched into a loud tirade about the alleged undiscipline of the platoon in the state of the barracks. He and I then went to the barracks and tossed it, turning up multiple prison shank type weapons. He wrecked it, overturning mattresses, throwing linen everywhere, upending footlockers, and so on. The idea was to provide plausible cover for the kind that informed on the plot. Sergeant Robinson recovered a cardboard box full of sharpened spoons, pieces of rebar from a construction site next to our barracks, a piece of 2x4, and so on. They could have easily killed Taylor with all those weapons. The locks and a sock would have come from their footlockers. Taylor was transferred to our sister platoon. Recruit platoons came in a series of 2 platoons, like PLT 3001 and PLT 3002, to get him out of our barracks. Smith was questioned briefly, but no further action was taken. I asked Sergeant Robinson what would happen to Taylor, and he said nothing. When I protested, he said, "Private, if he's really a rapo, he'll try it again and they'll get him." I realized that if they investigated Taylor, we would all be stuck there longer, and the drill instructors would get a black mark on their records. Boot camp is a weeding out process of people unsuitable for military service in the Marine Corps. Typically, a recruit platoon will lose 10% of its members to casual company, where they're discharged for the good of the service, for being mentally, physically, or morally unfit. We started out with 98 recruits. We graduated 78. Our platoon graduated on time. Taylor graduated the same day we did, but with a different platoon. And we all went home on leave. Story 74. If there is a subreddit for effed up stories about inpatient facilities, let me know. I worked at an inpatient facility for 5 years, and this facility took almost exclusively the kids no one else in the state wanted. This is a lighter story, but one day they gave me a break and let me go work at our low-intensity facility because they had hired a new worker and it was her first day there. So basically it was a nurse, the new employee, myself, and 9 kids, ages from 12 to 18. The first few hours were fine and no incident, so we decided we would take them outside for games and whatnot. It wasn't uncommon to take them outside because the facility was like our last step before sending them home. The biggest concern was potential runaways. The facility itself used to be a doctor's home that got renovated to be a facility, but still felt like a home. It was on a cliffside, about 150 to 200 feet drop into a fairly fast and wide river. Back to the story. So we take the kids outside, but the nurse stays in to get meds ready for the PM. So I'm playing basketball with some kids and we're having a good time. One kid who was sitting out decided he wanted to play. Well, he was sitting out because he was in a leg cast up to his knee. Before I decided to let him play, I told him to make it easy and just kind of walk around and shoot. It was going fine for about 5 minutes. Then the kid misses his third or fourth shot and gets angry. He screams something along the lines of "F this cast," walks over to the goal and goes behind it and gets a rock. I walk over by him and kind of just try to talk him down. He hits the rock against his cast twice, and the third time, I manage to grab his hand/rock before he makes contact. He let go of the rock and immediately starts to climb the fence and protects balls from rolling too far away. He managed to just start climbing before I grab his not broken leg. I said, "If you don't come down on your own, I'm gonna have to take you down, and I don't want you to get hurt." He looked at me like I was a effing idiot. I'm only 5'10", 170 pounds, and I think I was 22 at the time. As my username implies, I ran track at the collegiate level, so I was in fairly good shape. Now, the kid was only 14, but he was about 6'4" and 190 pounds. He decided to climb down, but only to grab a rock and resume hitting his cast. I let him hit it 2 to 3 times before I said, "If you don't stop this now, I'm taking the rock away again." He goes for another swing, and I grab the rock and look at him. Apparently, he wasn't a fan of this and immediately swung at me with his free hand. To get a better picture, he's sitting on the ground and I'm crouched beside him. So as he swings, I move closer to him, chest to chest, push him on his back, and move my legs where both my knees are close to his head, but his arms are trapped under my arms. So I asked the new employee to take the kids inside and send the nurse out. She managed to convince him to calm down by letting him know that if he doesn't, he'll get shots. Our shots are designed to basically put a kid to sleep for 4 to 6 hours within 5 to 10 minutes. After about 30 minutes, we had him packed up and had to take him back to our main facility. Story 76. Former inmate. Did 1 year county jail bid last year. It's in a very populated county in Florida, so there were plenty of the typical Florida man types there. Granted, it was county jail and not state prison, so it was a little more relaxed. Still saw and heard some crap though. I started medium custody and made it to low custody, so I was an inmate worker, trustee, for the last 6 months of my stay. I got to know a few officers, some of which were pretty cool. It's all about mutual respect. One even brought me a Whopper a few times after a very crappy, literally, workday. I worked first shift on the psych floor. All single cells and some SR cells, self-unalive risk/butt naked cells. Heard from some of the COs about a dude in maximum coming back from sentencing. He got life and was pretty upset about it. He told the CO when he got back that he needed to be alone. He wasn't given any special treatment. That night, he liked his bunkie by sitting on him and shoving toilet paper down his throat until he suffocated. And funny story about a typical Florida man paying people back because he couldn't afford commissary, but letting them do butt stuff on command. He was a nice dude, but incredibly stupid. Sad to see people take advantage. I got more if anybody is curious. Jail, if nothing else, is a really funny place. Lots of joking and just weird situations. Not everyone is a rival gang lurking around the corner or don't drop the soap showers. I mean, that's there. You gotta be careful. It's just not all bad. Story 77. I work at a juvenile detention center as a probation officer, PCO. I just got off duty. As a side note, the amount of youth who attempted to harm themselves is too damn high. Last night alone, 3 youth were placed on self-unaliving watch for tightly wrapping clothing around their neck. The most extreme would be when one youth convinced his roommate to act out like a royal fool with him. They were both secured in their room for changing shifts. The roommate jammed their cell door with random hygiene products. While he was occupied doing that, he didn't realize that his roommate was attempting to harm himself. He wrapped a ripped bed sheet around his neck. He lost consciousness and fell to the floor. This youth was always a bleeder, so when he hit the floor, blood started pouring out. Probably from his ears and nose, not sure. Needless to say, the roommate freaked out. He was hysterical when he saw his buddy unresponsive. Instant regret showed on his face. He started punching the door, hoping it would open. Keys or the automatic unlock button did not work. We burnt the motor trying to unlock the cell door. Took a crowbar and some huge-ass male staff to get the door unlocked. The whole time, the roommate was cussing at staff for not being able to open the door that he jammed. Also, he messed up his good hand trying to punch the door down. There was blood in the shape of his fist on the door. When the door finally opened, nursing staff rushed in to save the youth. He recovered. His roommate was escorted to another unit, so he didn't have to see any more of that. He felt so guilty that he attempted to hurt himself the same way. Staff were able to prevent him from actually doing it, however.